Current and former residents of an HOA. What's your I'll never live in an HOA again story? We had a cookie cutter house built. One of the color palettes we could choose from included an accent color for the door/shutters that was a dark purple. The hubs and I are a little kooky, so we selected it. At our final walkthrough, our door and shutters are brown. I tell the general that it's wrong and show him my contract. We're the only homeowners in the subdivision that selected that color, so the HOA decided to not offer it to anyone. We said, fine, that puts you in a breach of contract and we want to be released. A few phone calls later, my door and shutters are purple and I'm happy. We purchased the house. At least once a year, we got a nasty letter from the HOA about unapproved door color. Every time I sent them a copy of my contract and their bylaws stating that the colors from the builder are allowed. Not my problem you guys discontinued it after I picked it. Story 2. I live in a neighborhood that has a $1 a month HOA because we have a shared drive with an area drain. That money goes into emptying the area drain every couple of years. The CC&Rs are very laid back. There are no rules, so I wrongfully assume that would be the experience living here. The HOA president, the guy who schedules the area drains being emptied, is a boomer on a power trip. He's in my business about everything. I got a new furnace and he threatened to sue me because the utility company had to use the highway. I scheduled a specialty garbage pickup with my garbage company and he called me screaming that I put my garbage out in front of my house that morning. I have a retaining wall in front of my house and he came by and yelled at me for cleaning it. The list goes on and on. Total nightmare experience, and I will never live somewhere with an HOA of any kind ever again. Story 3. I love reading contracts and agreements, so when a friend of mine told me about his HOA troubles and not letting him keep his boat behind his house, I jumped on the opportunity. After reading, sourcing, and finding a few rulings, I learned that they have very little power to enforce what they can't see from the road, which affects property value. He took my documentation to the HOA and requested that they remove his fines. They refused, saying, quote, "The agreement says nag nag nag," and after a few months he finally paid a real estate lawyer $2,000 to go talk circles around the HOA, and they finally backed down, removed his fines, and allowed him to keep his boat. Then, out of pure spite and with my design, we built a 40-foot tall temporary structure, conforming to both the HOA agreement and building code to fly a flag on a further 25-foot pole. We took it down and put it back up every 3 months for a year. You could see it from almost anywhere in the neighborhood. It was a real triumph, and it was hideous. Story 4. My HOA had a coup where half the board resigned on the spot. Same day, and the 3 board members that were left handed management of our neighborhood over to some mega HOA corporation based out of LA. Before the handoff was complete, the chairman of the board fired everyone that worked for the HOA, including our incredibly talented accountant who, due to his experience, kept our finances so tip-top that we had a surplus of money and have never had our monthly dues raised in almost 15 years. When we, the residents, demanded an explanation, the chairman refused by quoting an article from our HOA charter, which gives the board the explicit right to manage the community however they see fit and without needed approval from the residents. He basically told us, "I don't owe any of you an explanation, so suck it." Now we're trying to overturn his decision to essentially give our neighborhood over to some crappy HOA management group that treats its residents horribly like a crappy landlord would a tenant. Oh, and the management group that we were given to is run by a man whose only formal education is a degree in opera. And the accountant who's been assigned to manage my neighborhood's finances does not have a degree in finance or business. She has a degree in ballet. It's my opinion that our board was bribed into selling us to that management firm. Our community hired a lawyer, and we're in the process of reversing what our board has done. If successful, we're going to rehire everyone they terminated and change the bylaws to prevent anyone from ever being able to do this again. So yeah, that's my worst story, and it's still going on right now. Story 5. Not my story, as I would never live in an HOA neighborhood. My sister bought a house in an HOA neighborhood 3 years ago. To be fair, none of us are super familiar with HOAs since none of us has ever had to live in one, and my sister was told the HOA fees were just for lawn upkeep and snow removal. The realtor who showed her the house said that the HOA really didn't get involved in anything except for doing the lawns, removing snow, and trimming weeds. The whole experience has been an I'll never live in an HOA again story for my sister. The trouble started pretty much the second she moved in there. The first issue was the electrical not working. My dad, RIP, was a master electrician, so went over there to troubleshoot and fix the issues. He was over there working on some rewiring, and one of the HOA boards came up and asked him what he was doing. My dad told her he was fixing the electric. The HOA board member had a fit about my dad having a small red toolbox out on the porch. My dad got back in her face, and she went off in a huff. Second issue was my sister planting some roses. The roses were the wrong color. Only pink, white, or light peach roses were allowed. My sister had committed the cardinal sin of planting red roses. The HOA flipped out and demanded she remove them and fine her for it. Another dumb issue was a citation for her teenage, at the time, daughter, quote, loitering with a group on the front steps. Her daughter had been standing on the steps for a few moments talking with another girl and exchanging phone numbers. My sister has always been a person to do what she wants, so you can imagine this went over really poorly. She painted her door bright blue out of anger. She rips up the notices of fines and leaves them in the HOA president's mailbox. She has the house on the market and has another picked out. She's supposed to hear this week if she's approved or not. Okay, is there such thing? This is a very serious question. Is there such thing as an HOA that actually is tame and doesn't just lose their mind over everything? I feel like every HOA is just anal about this. You're really going to write her up and fine her because her sister or her daughter is standing on the porch, or because you have a couple of red roses in your garden? Like, get out of town, man. That's wild. Story 6. My HOA president walks around the neighborhood every day and takes pictures of any violations he finds. There's a management company that does monthly checks for violations, but that's not enough for this old, bored, retired man. About a month after having a baby, I got a knock on the door from the HOA president, which I answer in my post-surgical breastfeeding outfit, because a palm frond hadn't been trimmed after being down for 3 days. Then I got a written notice the next day. Then I got another notice 2 days later. The HOA maintains the roads, and there's a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit. People drive pretty slow. These idiots put in 3 speed bumps on a 200-foot stretch of road. I've never seen anyone blast through, and I regularly go on walks. They also put up a security camera, raising our monthly dues, because one neighbor left their garage door open all day and someone took a few things. We clearly live in a dangerous area full of criminals. I can't sell yet, but when I do, never living in an HOA again. Story 7. I could write a book on the topic. I've spent several years on the HOA board, so I know when people complain about me, which helps immensely because they're too passive-aggressive to actually confront you. It's not the fact that they hired an attorney to see if they could force my wife to close her business. No signs for business, no in-person traffic, they just hate us. But how our official Karen has been with my kids. When someone brought up that a kid had left a popsicle stick in their yard 2 weeks ago, I pointed out that it's not even something that can be dealt with after the fact and should never be an HOA concern, but if they see my kids do something inappropriate, like dropping something where it doesn't belong, to just tell them. That was my fatal mistake. The Karen made it her life's mission from that point on to follow my kids and watch them at all hours for the tiniest little thing and antagonize them. When my child, who's on the spectrum, was playing with water balloons, she approached and dared him to throw one at her. He was 8 or 9 at the time. I wish he'd done it. When the kids were sitting on the rock wall that divides my property from the neighbors, she made a huge stink about it because it was for sale and would keep buyers from being interested. It actually sold for $50,000 above asking price. She blocks every design we submit for a fence for our new puppy, so we integrated every design concept that she hated into movable planters with a temporary gate because there are no rules on landscaping and because we hate her. We know all the loopholes. I've been triggered enough by these examples. Edit to add more grievances. Couldn't let it go. So I don't like HOAs to begin with, but I think it's fine to follow rules to be a good neighbor. But taking official actions against people is so unnecessary most of the time. Soon after moving in, over 7 years ago, my wife and I divorced, and I was a single dad with 5 kids and a bit overwhelmed. I got official warnings from the board saying that I would be fined $30 a day for failing to landscape my backyard within 6 months of moving in. Nobody could even see it, but technically it was a requirement. I could barely afford to live, so hiring someone was out of the question. I spoke to the HOA president and tried to be human about it. Those who had pressured or action against me ended up being the reason why he resigned within a year and why I stepped in. Another family had a daughter the same age as my daughter, and they became good friends immediately. After a few months, they stopped answering the door. The kids had been going to private school, and we began getting looks of disapproval for being, quote, beneath them or something. The mom is also the neighbor who ignored my email on the day that a passing bee colony rested on the community fence, and a beekeeper was on the way to rescue them. She sprayed most of them with poison so they could not be removed any longer. Harmless honeybees. I was so mad. After my wife and I remarried, we had our second 5th anniversary this year, it was easier to avoid most confrontations except for the new president going off about garbage cans being out too long. In 1 month, we had taken the garbage cans out right before a camping trip, and so they weren't brought in the day the cans were picked up. Not until the following morning. I got an email. My wife and I went out of town another week that month, and my son forgot to bring the cans in. Shouldn't be a big deal. Life is busy and it's rarely left out. But it was when I was on a business trip, and I got an email at 10:30 p.m. about my cans, and they weren't even technically late, and I was threatened to be fined that I had been out all day. I asked if he wrote emails to everyone because it was ludicrous. He got mad and publicly went off to everyone about people questioning his authority. I left it alone because I knew that even if I proved him wrong, he wouldn't understand it, so it's a waste of energy without there being fines issued. He moved out anyway this year, along with another annoying neighbor who was on the board. Only one Karen remains. We're only 14 homes, but for her, I enjoy messing with her at Christmas with a 12-foot inflatable Mickey Mouse, laser lights, music. Many neighbors know what we're up to and why it's intentionally annoying, and our next-door neighbor isn't bothered. I care about that relationship. Good people there. Between that and the green twisty slide off our deck that went in before the HOA, we have some comfort in fighting back. Okay, so I don't know if these HOAs have like some kind of overhead that's basically threatening them to walk the straight and narrow, but like, why do they fuss about nothing? Like, no harm, no foul. If what people are doing or not doing to or around their homes isn't actively affecting anyone else in the neighborhood, like, let it go. Who cares? Story 8. My former HOA threatened to take me to court over the color of a light bulb inside of my condo. They claimed that the color of a bulb inside my unit altered the exterior appearance of the building. I had had Philips Hue lights for probably over a year without issue. Then my neighbor left up their Christmas lights well past New Year's and received a complaint about it. Next thing I knew, someone complained about my Hue lights. I switched them to white. I would have won in court, but it wasn't worth angering a bunch of petty a-holes who have nothing better to do than to sit on an HOA board. Anyway, the association wanted to add a new amendment that allowed them to sue anyone over anything they deemed a nuisance. They brought in their lawyer for a question and answer session. I asked if the color of my neighbor's lights could be considered a nuisance. He clarified that it had to be a bigger concern. I followed up, asking if we could claim that my neighbor had altered the exterior appearance of the building. He laughed and said no dismissively. So by that point, their lawyer had already admitted their case was unwinnable, and he'd said earlier in the meeting a big part of his job was to keep the association from taking an unwinnable case to court. So the lights were whatever color I wanted them to be from then on. I now live in a neighborhood without an HOA. Sometimes a neighbor's grass is a bit high and another neighbor just built a patio in the front yard, and sometimes people put trash out a couple days before the city says they can, and nobody says anything. It's wonderful. Story 9. A week after moving in, I received a letter from mine saying I was spotted not cleaning up after my dog in the common area. That was a blatant lie. Every single time he pooped there, it was picked up. I didn't have roommates at the time, so there was no way it could have been someone else. The fine would be a $100 fine after the first warning and $150 after that. I wrote back telling them I didn't appreciate being lied to and accused, and that was not the way to welcome me to the neighborhood. I went on to inform them that if it happens again and they provide no evidence to back their claims, they will be hearing from my lawyer for harassment. They would do that to everyone that moved in with a dog. They constantly made up special rules about parking depending on who it was for. Us couldn't park on the road at all. Others could. Brought that up to them and then called the president any time I saw a car parked. He didn't like the constant calls. I started parking on the street, and when he said something, I told him to F off and have the same rules for everyone or shut the F up. He shut up about it. They would complain about the backyard that could only be seen if you purposely went out of your way to look. They said they had to keep the community looking beautiful. I asked why there's always trash not picked up and little liquor bottles everywhere. Why weren't they picked up on his beauty walks? No answer. I made it a point to pick out every little thing in his yard and called him to report him. He didn't like that. Told him to stop harassing me or I'm getting my lawyer because he's singling out his house, and it's going to end now or he's going to be paying for the consequences. Story 10. Oh man, the reason I signed up for Reddit was to share my HOA story years ago. Let's just say this, my HOA was $800 when I sold it last month. It's due to go up to $840 in July. Went up $100 every year since 2015. I bought it at $425 monthly. Next, I got complaints, 2 to 3 times a week. Thin walls. Neighbor across the hall upstairs would be dropping weights. My downstairs neighbor would call to complain that it was me. I got fined $500 when I was deployed, 7,000 miles away for noise. I sent a video showing I was not home at the exact time the noise complaint came in. This happened at least 20 times in the few years I lived there. My record was full of complaints of exact times I was either working at the hospital or deployed. Oddly, the noise complaints never came in when I was home. I also had a carpet and got complaints about rolling noises. The plumbing was wrecked. The wall next to my condo flooded inside several times. I got called at 3 a.m. to hire a plumber to fix it. $700 later, plumber billed the HOA and not me. It was an HOA problem, but these fools tried to blame me over and over again. They did this to me every 6 months for 5 years. Oddly, that thing kept flooding. They never figured out where it was coming from. I got fined $250 for having a tiny glass bowl in the barbecue area. Not pool, barbecue. No warning, nothing. I appealed it. They called me to sit in on a board meeting. My patient had just committed self-unaliving, and I was trying to find family to pick up his body from the VA morgue. But here I was, explaining and begging the HOA to not fine me $250 for a small bowl. The number of complaints we had against the HOA was amazing. Completely misappropriating funds, abusing their power on the regular. It's the best thing to happen to me. To sell and get the hell out of that hellhole. It was an absolute nightmare. Worst decision of my life to live in that building and deal with that HOA. Story 11. It's 6:30 a.m. and my cats are going nuts, and I realize someone is in my backyard. At the time, I worked as a bouncer and very frequently got the "I'm going to come to your house" type threats. I live in the same HOA, albeit a huge one, as a bunch of the a-hole customers. My sliding door starts jiggling. I grab a gun and throw open the blinds. Outside, on my porch, is an effing old man. I start screaming, make him get on his knees and call the cops. Lo and behold, he's an inspector from my HOA. There because a neighbor reported me cutting down a half-dead tree that was about to fall on my house. Town cops show up. They're actual police, but only work in the HOA. They're not happy with me, but because I said the right words on the 911 call, the county sheriffs also show up. They basically have an argument with the local cops about the fact that being a HOA inspector doesn't allow you to come onto someone's enclosed deck, and that since I didn't physically attack the inspector, I didn't commit a crime. We spend all morning going back and forth. Finally, we basically agree to a everyone go home agreement. HOA sends me a strongly worded letter. Story 12. I usually like living in HOAs, and the ones that I've lived in have been decent, but my parents' HOA is insane. When my dad was diagnosed with cancer and began his chemo, he became too weak to walk. My parents installed a ramp at the front door so he could get his wheelchair into the house. Their neighbor, the HOA president, went crazy. She demanded doctor's notes, appointment slips, and that my dad prove to the neighborhood that he could walk and was lying. My dad was too weak to do anything, and Mom was too passive, so I had to step in. I threatened to lawyer up and sue her personally. She eventually backed down. My dad passed away in April, and a week after, she came banging at our door saying she saw the funeral home come and pick my dad up and that we need to take the ramp down now. Quote, that he's finally dead. Her exact words. At that point, I called the police right in front of her to report her for stalking and harassment. I moved in with my mom, and now, every time this woman sees me, she runs back into her house. On another note, she follows neighborhood kids home from school, asking their names and where they live, because she wants to know if they really live there. And my neighbors and I have caught her many times looking into our backyards. Yeah, stalking and harassment sounds about right. Repeat offender. She needs to not only be removed as the HOA pres, but maybe serve a little time in jail for being a creep. Story 13. My husband and I have a home with an HOA. Our most recent letter was a picture of our trash can out on the street, basically telling us that we put our trash out too early for pickup. The photo was taken on Friday at 3 p.m. and trash pickup was on Saturday at 6 a.m. So they sent us a letter that it isn't acceptable. Also, one of the lights in our garage had gone out and we received a letter with a picture about that as well, that we had to fix it immediately or be fined. We're also not allowed to park on the street without a pass from the HOA hung in the car. We didn't know this and were moving in at the time. We parked one car in the driveway and one on the street, grabbed some boxes, went inside with them, and by the time we came out, there is a huge neon sticker on the window telling us the rules and that we would be towed. That sticker was a female dog to remove, and we were literally parked there for maybe 10 minutes at that point. So annoying. Story 14. So, when I was a kid, my mom moved to a townhouse complex, which had a strata council, which was basically an HOA. I often keep late hours, so I like to keep my windows blacked out so I can sleep in. So I tinfoiled my windows, which were recessed basement windows. You could not see these windows without being on our property. She got a notice to remove them, because no window coverings are allowed unless they're white or beige. She passes this along to me. So I take the tinfoil down, put white paper over the windows, and then tinfoil behind that. And to further improve things, I then add a layer of black construction paper. No light is getting through, and it's all white from the outside, which is allowed. They then drop off a note asking what time they can come by to inspect to make sure there's no tinfoil on the inside of the window. My mom and I had a good laugh over this, and ignored the letter. They sent a follow-up, more demanding, angrier letter. We ignored that too. Eventually, they sent one threatening fines, and my mom sent one back that lied and said they had already inspected, and they needed to figure their crap out. And then she got an apology and no further hassling on this issue, because the Strata Council was full of busybodies who hated each other, and no one wanted to admit that they were out of the loop. Story 15. I built some very nice planters for my wife's garden. 3 years later, the HOA told me that the planters violated some HOA rule. I told them by not being it up 3 years ago, they had by default approved of them. They let it drop. Other things our HOA did. Wouldn't let us grill on the front porch, wouldn't let us park in the street for more than 3 days a month, wouldn't let us mow our own lawn, wouldn't put in the city-mandated fire break behind our house on property they owned, made us pressure wash a fence that no one could see without coming into our backyard, check my gutters to make sure I was cleaning them. That was just a small sampling of our HOA experience. The most interesting thing is that they wouldn't fix street lamps that broke or road damage unless they were in front of an HOA member's house. Oh yeah, for the privilege of them hiring a company to do a horrible landscaping job and to pave the road every other year, we paid over $2,000 a year. Seriously, these people are the worst sort of people. All of their self-worth seems to be wrapped up in other people's lives. Story 6. Lived in an HOA where many people own dogs. I went and got one myself. We had a large shared backyard, no fence, so I'd put him on a long leash for him to go enjoy it. I could sit out with him or easily watch through the window. My dad had a spat with the neighbors, so they decided to complain that they didn't feel comfortable using the yard with the dog there. For one, he's the sweetest boy in the world. Loves everyone. Secondly, I've never used the yard before anyways. They put a tiny little fence around their pad. Anyway, I guess despite everyone else knowing it, it's against the rules to have a dog on a long leash, so I had to take him out with a hand leash. So I'd walk him right over in the front of their pad and just stare as he did his business. They stopped coming outside because they were very cowardly when it came to any confrontation. We also complained that their dogs were off the leash scaring people. Since their fenced-in pad was deemed shared space, they had to stop letting their barky rats out. Story 17. Lots of stories of horrible HOAs on here, so I thought I'd share what my neighborhood's HOA is like, and what all HOAs should be like. It is optional. You don't have to join if you don't want. The fee is $15 a year. For this, you get a neighborhood name here, newspaper, that talks about what's happening near the neighborhood once a month. It's stuff like, library in town is looking for volunteers, and the main road into our neighborhood might get a stoplight. Please attend city meeting, blah blah blah, to show your support for this idea. Once a year, the entire neighborhood has a garage sale all at once, and if you're part of the HOA, you get your house marked on the map of houses that are participating. Those maps are then handed out for free. You will get a little newsletter whenever a new house sells that tells you what it was listed at and what it sold for, so that you have an updated idea of what your house is worth if you decide to sell. There's an HOA site that you can post if you need help with something house-related or need a recommendation for a tree trimming service or whatever. Neighbor Oscar posted that he broke his ankle and could someone please recommend him a good lawn care service. Instead, one of the other HOA members just decided to come over and do his lawn work until he gets better, for free. We live in a place that tends to get extreme weather. When it floods, the HOA will go out to the affected houses and make sure everyone is okay. We're talking about 9 feet of water in the basement type of flooding. Most of the time they do it via boat, which is fun to watch. During Christmas time, the HOA raises money for homeless shelters. All excess money is put in a pool where the members decide what to do with it. Most of the time it's take care of the dead tree on the empty lot, but this year they got a tiny library on the grassway. This is what a HOA should be. This is a good HOA. Edit. I forgot to add that during Christmas season, they have a competition for most decorated house. So whoever puts up the most lights and decorations gets a little certificate congratulating them. It's cute. They also have a rule about the same house can't win 2 years in a row so that more people have a chance at winning. I was also told there was a crazy guy about 20 years back that wanted to make the neighborhood its own park district, and when people didn't really agree with the idea, he threatened to sue everyone who didn't sign his petition. You can probably imagine how well that went. Okay, so finally, a positive story about a great functioning HOA that uses their powers to help people, not deliberately make people miserable. I was wondering if/when we were going to get one, and we got one. So awesome. Story 18. They're rampant in Florida. Live in an area near a lot of military installations, so there are a lot of troops that see deployment. HOAs are just evil. They sneak around, unannounced and unwelcome, documenting the most asinine of conditions. I had a very minor dent in the bottom aluminum panel of my lanai screen door. Citation. In the next subdivision, there were people literally having to spray paint their lawns green during a drought and consequent watering restrictions so they didn't have brown/yellow stains on their lawn. In some cases, these citations pile up and they can actually put a lien against your house. There have been more than a few cases here where a deployed soldier will return stateside to find their property either in a state of default or under such fine levy that they have no way to pay. Restrictions for flags, outdoor barbecues, holiday ornaments, you name it. Some are worse than others, but sometimes it just depends on what council of angry Karens you get. Story 19. AT&T has some sort of junction or hub box underground in my front yard. They have dug up my yard 4 times now because they keep having some error in the fiber lines. One time, they broke my sprinkler and replaced it with a different type of sprinkler head. So rather than a 180-degree mist that goes out 15 feet, I have a stream that shoots out 30 feet, oscillates, and hits my house. AT&T wouldn't change the sprinkler head because they said it was functioning. When they dig these massive holes in my yard, they end up killing all the grass where the hole was, and then 8 to 12 feet by 4 to 5 feet where they dump the pile along the side of the massive hole. So when all is said and done, I usually have a 20-foot by 10-foot patch of dead area/clay. I live in North Carolina, and once they get through that minuscule top layer of topsoil I had down, it's difficult to grow anything when they fill the hole back, inevitably leaving clay on top. My HOA came around the first time AT&T was digging and asked me if I had a permit to be digging, to which I responded, "I'm not digging, that's AT&T. The gentleman then said, "Well, since you're getting service from them is causing this eyesore, you will start receiving fines in 3 days if this isn't cleaned up." I responded, "I don't even have AT&T. This is a junction servicing the rest of the street. I utilize Spectrum." At that point, I thought it was over, as he seemed to nod in understanding. So AT&T finishes up a week later. Luckily, no fees assessed by the HOA, but AT&T does an absolutely terrible job of fixing the massive clay patch in my front yard. After 2 weeks, nothing is growing from the seed they dropped, and I get a fine in the mail for an unkempt front yard. I talked with the HOA board, and they would waive the fine if I fixed it over the weekend. I went out and bought a bunch of topsoil, seed, hay, lime, and fixed it up nice. No fine. 6 months later, AT&T is back. They dig it up again, put it back together horribly, and I'm back with a clay patch. I contact AT&T to file a claim to get it repaired. This time of year, there was lots of rain and all their seed took hold, but it ended up being all terrible crabgrass. When the claims adjuster from Sedgwick came around, He said, "Sorry, it's green, there's nothing we can do," even though it was crabgrass and weeds. 2 days later, I get a notice from my HOA that I need to de-weed my front yard or I'll get a fine. So I had to tear it all up again, buy more topsoil, seed, lime, and hay. AT&T dug up my heart about 6 months ago, and it ended up being the same thing. Crabgrass that lasted one season, and now everything on that clay patch is pretty much dead in weeds. My HOA is up my ass again about fixing it, but at the end of our development, AT&T has a huge 25 by 15 foot hole dug working on the fiber again. I've communicated to my HOA that until AT&T is finished and tells me they have totally fixed the problem with the equipment in my front yard, I'm not fixing anything else. I'm considering lawyering up against AT&T at this point, and I will extend those courtesies toward my HOA as well. Story 20. We still live in our HOA, and for the most part, we're happy here. But I do have stories from living here, and when we lived in a rental in a different HOA. Here they are. In the rental, received a notice that we're only allowed to park one of our cars in front of our house. All other cars need to be in the garage. We only owned one car, and it was in the garage. Received a notice that there had been numerous noise complaints regarding our barking dog. We didn't own a dog. Received a notice that there is a front doormat leaning up against our garage, and we needed to move it as it was considered debris. Turns out it was our neighbors who had a doormat leaning up against their garage. Received a notice that we could not have our barbecue on the front porch. This time we actually did what they accused us of, but the house has no yard. We only had a front porch, and it was the only place to use a grill. All of the above went on while our neighbors across the street has a pile of old junk on their porch and grilled regularly on their porch. In our current house that we own, had put up Christmas decorations. My gramps died just before New Year's, and we left to go to a funeral in a different state. We were home by the second week of January. Decorations have to be removed by the 15th, but we had a notice stating we were late taking down decorations. No big deal. Husband takes down lights. Days later, I get a second notice because we didn't comply. I'm confused, and it turns out the snowman decorations on my front door are in violation. They're now saying we have to attend a hearing and potentially pay a fine. I argue that the snowmen are not Christmas, but winter. They argue back, so I went around the neighborhood, wrote down violations I saw, without stating where, listed them in an email, and asked why we were being singled out. They dropped it. Also, they're supposed to give an initial notice, and then 3 warnings before they resort to a hearing. We'd received 1 notice and 1 warning. They claimed they'd sent all 3, but this would have meant they'd have to have all come within the first 2 weeks of January, before the January 15th deadline. It didn't make sense. We were re-landscaping our backyard. We weren't doing anything super crazy and didn't think we'd need prior approval, so I get a letter in the mail with a photo stating we're in trouble because we didn't get prior approval and we need to go through all these steps to set it right. But the photo was taken at an angle that only could have been taken if the photographer was in our backyard. This was illegal, so I responded, let them know that the photo they sent is proof they were in our backyard, and by some miracle, they backed off and no longer needed any paperwork from us. The HOA sent out notices that everyone had to paint their house. We only had so many weeks to comply. I wrote a nasty gram stating that this was completely unreasonable. Not everyone can just afford to have their house painted at the drop of a hat. Plus, it might not be possible to hire a company within that time frame if they're busy. Apparently, I was not the only one who complained as they backed off. Our neighbors have a gorgeous tree, and part of it hangs into our yard. It's kind of a pain, but it's so pretty and fills that part of the yard, so we deal with it. We like this tree. Neighbor informs me that they were told to remove it because of us. We never complained. I told my neighbor I love the tree and have never complained. I had to call the HOA to tell them that we're fine with the tree, but they could have asked us before harassing the neighbors. Those are the major incidents. There have been some minor ones. Story 21. The house my parents live in was grandfathered into the neighborhood, meaning it isn't part of the HOA, but that didn't stop them from writing us letters. One of them was about vines over our fence, so my stepdad wrote them the following response. We received your letter about the vegetation growing over our fence. While we do appreciate your concern about the beautification of our neighborhood, we cannot comply with this request at this time. The vegetation in question are usually assistance vines for our senior rhesus monkeys and have been left long due to their diminished ability to scale our fence during his nightly wanderings of redacted estates. While they only have about 3 years of life expectancy left, we feel that they deserve the same respect as any family member and do everything we can to accommodate their remaining days. As their mobility continues to decline, we may be reaching out to you for approval for slow monkey crossing signs for our street and alley with an image of a monkey in a wheelchair. Maybe we can get 6 different signs with each of their sweet little faces on them. They love to pose for pictures, especially in their little throwback baseball uniforms with the blousy trousers and little souvenir bats. Anyway, best of luck in your slow rolling alley checking searches for minor aesthetic annoyances. Maybe you can convince the guy that painted his door to resemble the Texas flag to correct the red and white stripes so it will be presented properly. Texas pride, y'all. The McVinnies. Their response was something like, "We'll look into it." They also wrote to us about our lawn having too many weeds in it. This was the response. Dear HOA rep, thank you for your thoughtful note and noticing the state of our weeds. While we understand the job of the HOA and the disturbingly creepy area of you slow rolling by people's houses looking for offenses, we're not actually members of your HOA. Our house was grandfathered in and not part of the HOA. Therefore, we do not have to adhere to your rules and standards. But I will address your concerns. One man's weed is another man's drought-resistant and environmentally friendly green lawn option. We prefer to call it xeriscaping. So from here on, we shall refer to weeds as such. We would love to not have weeds in our yard, but when we did treat for weeds, our entire yard turned to dirt. We decided the green color of the weeds was much more preferable to the dirt yard and would avoid harmful soil erosion. After all, the last thing we want is a mini, redacted lane dust bowl. As you may know, North Texas is in a severe drought, and getting new grass would not be feasible with the new watering restrictions of once every other week. The fertilizing and pre-emergent treatment for those common turf grasses leads to considerable chemical runoff, as well as into our creeks and drinking water providing reservoirs. So not only are we reducing our water usage, we're also making sure that you, your family, and all the baby ducks are not subjected to excessive nitrogen, phosphorus, and manufactured herbicides. We do have a yard crew that comes by weekly to keep the weeds in check, but unfortunately, as you know, weeds tend to be hardy and grow more quickly and vigorously than those pesky high-maintenance non-native turf grasses. On the flip side, our neighbors on both sides have installed creeping turf grasses which we promote to spread on a regular basis. We have honored the Saint of Augustine with numerous sacrifices and prayed to the god of Bermuda for health and vitality of its proud ground-covering creation. However, we hope that the sidewalk to our entry will provide a proper demarcation line to avoid an unfortunate turf war between the differing species. But at their current progress of 2 feet per year, we will have to wait until 2025 to be concerned about that. In the meantime, carry on your crusade against unsightly pitch and sagging fences. Between us and the retired military vet down the street with 13 window AC units, I'm sure we're collectively killing property values across the board. Maybe I can borrow some of the 3,000 cinder blocks that you have been sitting in my alley neighbor's driveway for the last 11 months to put an old car up in my front yard. We will continue to look to the city of redacted code compliance for guidance and recommendations on our landscaping standards, and should we receive notice from them, we will forward it to our landlord's house because we're renters. This is another factor that figures into why there had not been a solid investment on our part. We wish you the best of luck with your endeavor to keep our neighborhood a beautiful place, and next time you're in the area, stop by and check out our chicken farm in the backyard. Nah, we really don't have a chicken farm in the backyard. Or do we? Cheers. The McWheaties of 5637. Anyways, I don't think they've contacted us since. Story 22. I wish I didn't live in an HOA, but moving, especially right now, isn't really an option. The president of the board, who's been president for a while now, like more than 5 years, isn't even a resident. He's a renter, and renters aren't supposed to be able to be on the board at all, but nobody gives a F. The pool? Oh God, where do I even start? Let's see, when we first moved in, almost 20 years ago, there was a phone, like a normal household landline phone, attached to the side of the wall of the bathroom. It was, at least what I was told anyway, was for kids to call their parents if needed. Nope. People were using it to call Mexico and South America on the HOA's dime. They ended up taking it out a year later and replacing it with a phone that only calls 911. When we first moved in, there was some kind of lift chair thing so that disabled people would be able to get into the water easily and safely. It was gone within a few months because parents were letting their kids use it as a diving board and it broke. After a decade of vandalism, damage to the pool, etc., they decided to start hiring security guards to watch the pool in the evenings and on the weekends. And they are crappy at hiring security standards. There was one guy who was an ex-Marine who liked to scream at everyone and said that the reason kids were how they are these days is because nobody spanks the crap out of their kids anymore. There was also the guy who lasted all of a week and got fired because my husband, son, and I went to the pool one evening and found him sitting in the baby pool in his underwear and a white undershirt. There was a guy who got fired because he thought that just because he was working at an HOA pool, it meant he had a carte blanche to bring his kids and wife. Then there was a guy people started referring to as Postal. He was super creepy. He had a thick accent and liked to block people from coming into the pool so he could monologue at them. He would stalk around the cars in the parking area. There were about 10 parking spots outside the pool, staring in the windows in a super creepy manner. He would let anybody and everybody passing by into the pool, whether or not they had their card to unlock the gate. He told my son not to drink the water out of the fountain because it was dirty and nasty, and offered him a bottle of water, which I politely refused because Lord knows if it was spiked with something or not. He would go outside the pool to the park next to it and be creepy at kids playing in the park. At night, there were some teenage girls at the pool being dumb teenage girls and taking photos of each other with their phones. Postal started freaking out and yelling at them and taking videos of them with his phone, saying that they were taking videos and making fun of them. I don't know if they were or not. The final straw came at the HOA's Labor Day party, when I told one of the board members that Postal had been stalking my car again, and it really made me uncomfortable. Postal overheard me, threw a fit, and spent the rest of the party in his car fuming. The board member decided to scream at me, saying I was the reason he quit, and that they, the board, was getting too many complaints about Postal and I was behind it. I was not, though I did submit complaints about his creepy-ass behavior, and I was horribly embarrassed. I thought for sure that would be the last we'd see of Postal. Nope. I nearly wrecked the car, driving back into the neighborhood the next summer one day, and saw him sitting in the pool area again. I found out from the HOA board that Postal claimed that our complaints had caused his PTSD to flare up, and the HOA had not only rehired the a-hole, but was paying for his counseling. Story 23. My HOA was run by the owners before I bought. Those owners had emptied the coffers and stolen all the money. They were arrested and prosecuted, so the HOA hired a management company. Almost immediately after buying, my roof leaked and damaged the interior of the home. The HOA was responsible for roof maintenance, so my home inspector didn't even bother going up there to check it out. The management company claimed because it was damage to the interior of my unit, I was responsible. I was just out of law school and knew that was bullcrap. I told them the damage was a result of their negligence and they were responsible. They had the worst lawyers I've ever spoken to contact me to tell me I was wrong. These guys' primary duty was placing liens on properties, not paying the HOA fees. They didn't know crap about negligence, the field I practice in. I just honestly could not be bothered to sue them that early in my career. Unsurprisingly, the first thing the HOA did when it had the money was replace all the roofs. Very obviously, because the lawyers told the management company, and I and everyone else that had a similar problem would win if we sued. F HOAs. Glad to own my own property now, but sucks to have to pay a lawn guy and shovel my own snow. I do miss that. Story 24. Happening right now, a legal roof and an attempt to cover up HOA-hired roofers. We shall call them Vendor E. To replace shingles. Vendor E submitted change order saying the plywood underneath is rotten and needs to be replaced. This was approved July 2020 by HOA. The vendor failed to pull the city permit for the re-roof construction work, despite our city requiring one to replace plywood layer. The vendor E did something wrong while working the change order, and my unit, along with 6 others, got water damage because it just happened to rain that day. I called the HOA emergency line that there was water damage on Friday after I got back home from work. I'm an essential employee, working in office occasionally as needed. There is a 6-inch long leak in the living room and a pool of water sitting on the floor for a minimum of 8 hours. Someone from vendor E came inside, put black tar-looking stuff all over my floor and the hallway, completely ruining the carpet, and said he'll fix it. He disappeared, dripping stopped, and nothing happened. The next day, it started dripping again. In bedroom, in kitchen, but it's the weekend, so no one came. The leak in the living room grew over 2 feet. The HOA emergency line just said, "Well, you have asbestos in your walls, so we can't do anything." Built in 1966. Try to keep stuff dry. Vendor E took 2 months, October 21st, 2020, to schedule an abatement for my place. Using a vendor G recommended by HOA, I asked HOA for a copy of the contract, document of change order, agreement between HOA and vendor E, stating vendor E will compensate for the damage. 4 times in the past 2 months. I've been ignored. I requested hoteling compensation. They said no. I fought for 1.5 months before they agreed to 2 nights of hoteling compensation. I've requested a proper scope of work and a quote estimation from second opinion vendor and third opinion vendor since vendor E has a clear conflict of interest. They were required to provide this within 60 days of the damage occurring per declaring document, but did not. They told me I have the right to call my own vendor in, but I have to pay the difference if my vendor quotes higher than vendor E. I requested a copy of the clean air test to know my place does not have asbestos in the air on Wednesday, since they only provided the hotel free till Wednesday. Vendor E didn't respond till Friday, saying they'll get me a copy when they get it too. I see black wet stains and mold growth in my ceiling because it's left open. It's 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Vendor E texted me that there's no mold and it looks dry with no proof. HOA is currently giving me the silent treatment. No promise on when or if they'll provide a bid by licensed vendors. Vendor E and HOA both are refusing to contact their insurance, trying to keep it in-house. A friend quoted me a minimum $25K to fix the warped floors, repaint, mold, asbestos, all that fun stuff. And that's just my unit, not mentioning the other 5. All my things are shoved to the side of the unit, so I can't even access/use anything. Happened before. Failed to fix the fire alarm in a condo. Failed to fix the staircase lights for 2 years plus. Failed to fix broken hallway tiles for a year, etc. Story 25. My parents lived in a 55 and up condo community which consists of townhomes, duplexes, and individual homes. You only own the inside and the association is responsible for everything on the outside. Paint, roof, gutters, grass, bushes. I checked on them daily and had power of attorney. Found and bought the condo. One day I'm sweeping out the garage and 3 people walk up with clipboards and tell me I'm going to need to paint the shutters as they're not an approved color. They had the same paint on them the day I moved them in and they were very weathered, so obviously hadn't been painted in years. I laughed and told them to go right ahead and paint them, and while they were at it, I listed about 10 other items they needed to attend to. A dead branch on a tree overhanging their patio, leaves in the gutter, etc. Then I told them the house is in a trust and I'm the executor and will be at the next meeting to address the poor job the lawn care people were doing, and I wanted to also address how money was being wasted, and I suspected someone was lining their pockets as the irrigation systems at the entrances were replaced 2 years straight. I thought I was going to need to call an ambulance as one guy about 70 started screaming and went from red-faced mad to pale as a ghost and grabbing a wall to hold himself up. Well, gutters got cleaned, lawn got special attention, and no one for 4 more years ever came by with a clipboard again. Forgot to tell you, previous to this, the guy that almost passed out had yelled at my 85-year-old mother for not having her garbage can off the street. I saw him walking down the street and told him to never, ever consider raising his voice to my mother again. Crazy old bullies on a power trip. Story 26. I do some accounting work for an HOA management company on the side. My personal favorite was an HOA board's president who wanted an association member's tenant fined for a truck. He said it violated the CC&Rs as it was a commercial truck because it had a ladder rack. The maintenance manager disagreed with the president but couldn't quite think of an articulate way of expressing it, so he asked me to help him out. I reviewed the CC&Rs and they didn't define the term, so I checked the state legal definition. The definition was narrow enough that even if the tenant used it for business purposes, it still didn't meet the commercial vehicle definition. I let the president know that it didn't meet the criteria. He said that it didn't matter because it was unsightly, shifted goalposts, and that I needed to fine the member. I knew full well these criteria didn't actually matter to him, and that he was simply being vindictive at this point. My response was, well, give me the exact definition you're using for unsightly, and I'll fine any owners whose vehicles meet it. At that point, he knew I had him, as his good friend and fellow board member had a total beater. We're talking about a mobile rust pile here. The truck he was complaining about was a Rolls-Royce by comparison. He knew that he couldn't give criteria that would exclude his friend. So, did he give up? Nope. He simply decreed that we fine the person and that his word was final and the matter isn't to be discussed any further. At this point, he had stopped CCing the board. So, what did I do? Well, I CC'd the entire board to my response, along with the email chain up to that point. It was simply, HOA President, commenting such an action would expose the HOA to unnecessary legal and financial risk. You, the board, and I have a fiduciary responsibility to the HOA members to not expose the organization to such risks. This is an extremely ill-advised action, so should you not respond, I will execute it in a legal and ethical way that eliminates this risk. The only way I can think of to do this is to fine any and all vehicles that match, or are worse, how unsightly this truck is. I have prepared a list of members' names and unit numbers that will be fined along with this truck. On the list, of course, was his friend and fellow board member. He decided that the matter wasn't resolved and that he would respond one last time, to drop the subject. I wonder what his friend thought when he caught up on the email conversation and saw that the president had gone down a path that could have led to his being fired. Story 26. I did a lot of construction work with my dad when I was a kid. We lived in a pretty bad neighborhood, so we didn't have an HOA, but we would travel around town, and sometimes it would be in a really nice neighborhood that had an HOA. I remember we were building an addition to a home, digging and laying the foundation, when the neighbor calls us over. My dad's business is word of mouth and recommendations, so he walks over thinking the guy wants to ask about prices. The dude does start asking questions about what we're doing, how long it's going to take, and if we can hurry it up. My dad gets a bit pissed but lets it go and walks away. The next day, the dude calls this security officer the HOA uses to patrol the neighborhood. Technically, we only assumed it was him who called, but it was confirmed by the owner later. He explained we're not allowed to be working unless we had a permit, and how he would be forced to call the cops if we could not produce it. We have to call the company that sourced us to get all of the paperwork, which takes forever because they're not great. We try to work, but the neighbor comes out and tells us to stop as we're not allowed to work without proof, and he'll call the actual cops. Since this was technically trespassing, as our work was visible, it fell under the jurisdiction of the HOA, even though we had the owner's permission to be there. Unfortunately, since we were stuck there, we still had to charge the owner for the day. He tells us it's cool when my dad tries to give him a discount and insists he pays full price. Found out later, he took the receipt we gave him and levied fines against his neighbor to pay reparations due to us having to charge for work we weren't able to do. All in all, not really frustrating for us as we were the masonry contractors and only worked on the foundation. I imagine the owner had tons of problems throughout the build that lasted for a few weeks after we were done. Additional story. Later on, I took this experience, and a few others, and I moved into a place with an HOA. It was really close to my job, had a large amount of bedrooms, home office, living space, garage, and the backyard was awesome with a patio. I love hosting/hobbying, so it was great. Before moving, though, the realtor mentioned HOA fees, and I remember some of the houses I worked on as a kid. I asked for a copy of the rules, laws, policy stuff, and he gets it for me. My family is a mix of high school dropouts, government workers, illegal immigrants, and laborers, so I have a mixed background when it comes to stuff. I used 200-ish bucks to set up an LLC and file some umbrella companies to protect myself legally. In the weeks before I move in, I get my family to sign papers stating that I have enough experience to take certification tests for various jobs. Really, I'm just a big old nerd who would read all the manuals and diagrams that my family would leave behind. And most tests have a minimum pass score or just see if you can reference code properly. I get certifications for plumbing, electrical, mechanic, and other random things. I then employ myself and put myself on as a retainer in the HOA for my house, basically giving myself carte blanche to do whatever I want so long as I can justify it. I set the move-in date and get a permit for the house so I can begin working on various things I wanted to edit about the place. I also read the HOA policy stuff, so I generally knew what I could and couldn't do, which wasn't much since I was contracted and any time limits I had. It wasn't bad because I was able to bypass most of it, but there were things like no loud work noises before 8 a.m. or after 6 p.m., no work on Sunday, no bright lights after sunset. 3 days into my new home, I'm already getting complaints and warnings. I'm excited because I dislike HOA people and love conflict. These mofos took pictures of me working on my car, making marks for a future dig I was planning, and power washing my driveway. I changed my oil day 1, then power wash day 2. Both things were not allowed unless done by professionals and approved by the HOA. I ignored the warnings and get a fine a bit later on. I immediately call the HOA and tell them that they incorrectly fined me, as a professional was working and they did approve it. They tell me they have to research some stuff and I get put on hold for like an hour. Thankfully, my military backgrounds have prepared me for waiting for hours on end for random crap. They get back to me and try to claim that the tenant had to hire someone and they couldn't work on these things themselves unless they had special permission from them. This is where I claim that the company 4 hired me, which was outsourced by company 3, and that all permits were held legally by the parent company 2. So I did have permission. It was all true. In name only, I owned Company 1, then Company 1 owned the rest. So I was a professional hired by a legitimate company that had the permit that allowed general work on the property that the tenant owned. I get put on hold again, and an hour later they get back to me. They try a whole bunch of different things to try and get me in line, but I've done everything by the book. My job in the military was administration, so I can read paperwork like a boss. I get it. They don't want other people to see me working and get to thinking they can make additions or edits to the property without approval or a contractor. More complaints come in, and some of my neighbors hate me, and I love every second of it. I eventually moved due to a promotion, and thanks to my edits, I actually made a nice profit on the house. Story 29. Oh man, you're giving me flashbacks of horror. I bought one of 5 condos in a top 10 U.S. city, was the 3rd unit to buy. The top floor was being lived in and finished off by the contractor. Let's call him A-hole. A-hole was an eccentric, chain-smoking, tough guy like so many contractors, and also, like so many contractors, was completely narcissistic. A-hole drove a motorcycle, womanized, and did good work, but was a effing psycho. I was always wary of him, but the condo unit we bought was indeed beautiful. So, A-hole is living up there and working on the unit for a good year. He's at the center of lots of fights and complaints of things that go wrong in our units, but overall, he does come back and fix what needs to be fixed in each of the owner's units. But we're all very nervous about how long it's taking him to finish the top floor. This was going to be a double unit, with a staircase up the roof where there would be a deck just for that unit. Eventually, he finishes the unit, and I'll give some equivalent numbers, but these aren't exactly right. Let's say each of the tenants paid $500K for our units. Real numbers will remain private. A-hole was going to list the penthouse for $750K. It goes on the market, but the market is rough and taking a downturn. He eventually sells it for $350K. We were all flabbergasted. He had just sold the 2-level penthouse unit for nearly 30% less than everyone else paid for their level 1 units, half the size. He wiped out the value of our units. A-hole told us he was desperate, the market was crap, and he had to move on/leave town. So the new tenant moves in. He's a wannabe white rapper with a wife who's a party coordinator. He's harmless, nice guy, smokes a lot of weed, whatever. He's in the building maybe a month, tops, before he comes to the board meeting and drops this bomb. My ceiling is leaking. And if his ceiling is leaking, that means it's coming from the roof, an HOA common space. Immediately, we all knew what had happened. A-hole knew there was a leak in the roof, so he sold the property at a rock-bottom price and skipped town. Property passed inspection because it wasn't raining that day, and voila, White Rapper Dude wants the HOA to fix the leaky roof. All the rest of us say no effing way. The only reason you got an $800K property for $350K is because A-hole sold you a lemon. This is between you and him. You gotta sue him. But of course, dude didn't want to sue. He got the deal of the century. He says the HOA should have fixed the leak before he bought it. From that point on, it was effing nuts. Everyone had an effing angle on this thing. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a legal option. We sent A-hole legal letters, and he said there was no leak when he lived there. If there was, it would have been an HOA problem anyway. He had lawyers send us back letters. Meanwhile, White Rapper's roof is leaking, and he's got a wife and kid, and we're all under him. We, of course, have to fix the roof. Time is ticking. Eventually, we worked out a deal with White Rapper. HOA paid some, he paid more, but still, the months of back and forth, the feeling of being effed by A-hole, metaphorically, I lost a lot of money in that building. To this day, I tell my kids, you can rent in an apartment building, you can rent a condo, but don't ever buy property with a HOA involved. I know that's a bold statement, and it might cost them some good investment opportunities, but I've concluded the headaches it saves them is worth it. Story 30. I get letters and threats and/or fines all the time for things that are not my fault. Just this year, my neighbor leaves his trash can out, but likes to put it near my driveway. It has his house number spray painted on it in very large white numbers, but he likes to leave it near my driveway entrance, so I get the fine. They even send a picture showing his house number on the cans. Was sent a letter to clean the stucco on the front of my house at the beginning of the summer. Cleaned it early August and it's spotless, looks brand new. They sent me a letter threatening a fine if I don't clean it by the end of the month, October. Look outside and next door looks like crap. Sent a letter explaining all the rules of keeping a tree in the front yard, how they cannot block windows, how tall they can be, how often they need to be trimmed, and the amount of a fine I'll get if I don't trim the tree immediately. I wrote back, we do not have a single tree on our property. They sent me another letter with a picture of my neighbor's house across the street. I write them again, this time explaining to them that all the house members in the photo are odd. I live on the even side. I circled the house number in the photo in my reply. They wrote me back a third time with a fine amount. I called up and yelled at them, and they had nothing to say other than, oops. Threatened with a fine for taking the trash cans out of my garage for one day in the middle of the week, only allowed to take them outside after 5 p.m. Sunday, so we can reorganize our stuff because that's what people do sometimes. Apparently, this was too much for them. The one time I ever asked for their help was about my neighbor not taking care of their flowers/weeds in front of their house, and it grows onto my driveway. They also planted 20 stargazer lilies in a small area which borders my driveway and close to our windows. My wife is horribly allergic. They don't care. Neither does the association. Never again will I live in an HOA neighborhood. Story 31. We're renovating our condo to get it ready for sale. The plumber turned off the water to the unit and the pipe disintegrated in his hand. He pops up and runs out to find the shutoff valve to our unit and finds that the only shutoff is for the entire side of our complex, about 24 to 32 units. And there's a big sign that says, nobody aside from XYZ Plumbing can touch valves. He calls a number and they say 3 to 4 hours before they can come out. Meanwhile, gallons of water are gushing into our condo. My plumber says F it and reaches in and turns off the valve. Guess what? It's 25 years old plastic that's been exposed to the elements. It also disintegrated. Now water has stopped flowing in my condo, but also every unit in the complex is now without water and hundreds and thousands of gallons of water are being spewed into the ground. After another couple of phone calls, they eventually get the water cut and the pipes fixed, and I was told a bill would be forthcoming. I called XYZ Plumbing and was told they had been recommending that those valves be replaced for 7 years and I shouldn't pay anyone anything. I spent a month and a half fighting with the HOA until I was finally told I wouldn't have to pay. Fast forward another month and I have a contract on the unit. Yay, I have to lose $45K on this absolutely terrible investment. And in the closing documents, there is a bill from the HOA for $6,800. The closing attorney called and asked if we hadn't been paying our HOA fees. I had to explain the situation to him and scramble for 3 days on the phone with the management company until they finally agreed to remove the charge and let me move forward. It was a nightmare. I will never live in a managed HOA neighborhood again. Story 32. had a bill sent to me saying I owed the $22K in back dues because an old Christmas tree rail connected my lot to their cul-de-sac. In a judge hearing, I didn't even have a lawyer because I thought it was something I could contest like a traffic ticket. Got scared crapless when 5 suits came in and I couldn't tell which smug bastard was the lawyer. They presented their bills, invoices, service listing, and repairs, totaling over the claimed $22K and demanded I pay my fair share. The judge looked over at the people pushing the papers on him as I just sat there quietly. Anytime he seemed ready to speak up, they chimed in another set of notes. During this, the judge would look over at me and then back at them. This seemed like enough. At the front of the gaggle of people shoveling in papers, this smug lady, who looked like a Hallmark movie author, spoke up as if to say in her own way, "Case closed." I was buried before I could get a word in. Yes, more or less. The judge just eyed things over again. Would you care to be sworn in now? Madam President seemed to glow at that comment, but I saw the lone fellow at the desk go pale. It was a short hearing, since even with the 12 minutes of talking and interruptions, they had jumped the gun on the process. It kind of put a bit of a spitfire under the judge, who, after getting everyone's name on record, asked whose property the repairs were done on. It was only those present, but it was for the HOA's benefit. His lips curled up on that one like a lemon. The HOA's benefit. Judge turned to me. Have you received any HOA benefits? Well, no, I'm here to contest, being in the HOA. I didn't ask you for that second part. He hammered back my statement before I could continue, as the witch's nose shot up, her way of smiling, I presumed. Afterwards, I just followed his questions as simple as possible, yes or no, as he pointed them out to me, nodding yes or no for me before I answered. I felt whipped to comply, but surely I had some rights outside of this, right? In the end, the judge talked me into the HOA wanting to cry, before immediately disbanding the HOA. In his skimming, he had no findings of a master plan community being put in place, and turned out each lot was developed independently. So despite all being built at roughly the same time by a bunch of rich people, this meant the HOA was voluntary and wasn't protected, especially when my lot and 2-track, basically fire lane, made it no longer a cul-de-sac. With the evidence shoved in front of him, the judge also noticed funding abuse and barred them from seeking additional funds till an investigation was done. The lawyer they had was still hired under the original HOA agreement, so attorney-client privilege was waived by the temp HOA to help sue the treasurer, president, and her board, aka kids, for the embezzlement. Their houses paid for the expenses/settlement, and a proper HOA was put in place without my lot. Judge shoehorned my statement in, so I got in on that action as well. Ended up buying a lawnmower with my part and scooped up the landscaping contract for a year with it. No bills were due. That drama shook me to my core. Even though I was part of an HOA for under a minute, I'll never live in an HOA again. Story 33. Condo Association. So, Canada's version of an HOA. I had a wooden retaining wall in my backyard, and my backyard is the only yard in the entire condo above grade. As others have commented, I own from the drywall in, and everything outside is the condo's responsibility. Common areas, yards, parking lot, etc. I spent 3 years warning the property managers and board that the retaining wall was rotting and they should do something about it. After all, it's outside. It's their responsibility. And I even offered to split some of the cost with them. Hey, if they're going to fix the retaining wall, maybe we could align the work for when I went to install a patio, and we'll cover our own costs at the same time. One summer afternoon, I get an official warning/fine notice that the retaining wall is rotting. Yeah, no kidding. I've been telling you guys that for 3 years. The notice gives me 2 weeks to fix it. We went back and forth for most of those 2 weeks. Hey guys, are you going to fix this? It's your responsibility to fix it. I've been telling you to fix it for 3 years. Fix it within 2 weeks or we'll start fining you and lien your property. You own the outside of the property. You fix it. Fix it within 2 weeks or we'll start fining you and lien your property. Okay, can we at least split the cost like I offered? I'll pay for my patio, you pay for the retaining wall. Fix it within 2 weeks or we'll start fining you and lien your property. Okay, can I at least have a bit of an extension? You have a 1-week extension. I ended up having a total of 3 weeks to remove this retaining wall, grade the backyard properly, and have a new patio installed. It cost over $5,500. With 3 weeks notice. F them. Story 34. We moved into a foreclosure. The HOA immediately charged us back dues for when it was empty. $350, and our lawyer at close said our only recourse would be to walk away. We should have then. It was in rough shape. It needed a new roof, all new windows, had squirrel holes in the attic, 2 external doors that needed replacing, and needed a ton of little jobs on top of that to get it to a habitable state inside. The outside needed work too. There were overgrown hedges, trees scraping, and a rotted out deck. We tore out most of the landscaping and put in a retaining wall. A month after we moved in, we got the first fine for weeds. We put weed killer on them, which left dead spots. We put down grass seed. We were fined because the grass doesn't grow fast enough. We were fined for setting landscaping stones next to the garage while we were actively building the retaining wall. Finally got a reprieve when we went to a meeting and said we planned on hiring a landscaper to maintain our yard in the spring. At the same meeting, the HOA board was telling a couple that the approved paint color was blue-green, but they had clearly painted their house green-blue. Fortunately, my husband got a better job and they offered to relocate us. We insisted no HOA when we bought a new house. Okay, serious question, because I don't want to speak from a place of ignorance. Is there actually a difference between the color green-blue and blue-green? Like, does one favor green slightly more, the other one favors blue? Either way, gosh, why are you such a jerk about this, HOA? Story 35. Rented in an HOA neighborhood. Our next-door neighbor was a county sheriff highway patrol officer. Our HOA were the biggest hypocrites and constantly abused or lied about the use of funds. Some gems of theirs include banning company vehicles from the neighborhood. This one will be important for later. Posting a failed water test for the neighborhood upside down in a locked notice board. Increasing HOA dues for an addition to the neighborhood pool. This addition was to be used in the winter by kids waiting for the bus so they could have a warm place to wait instead of standing in the cold. Instead, it was immediately locked off and used as the HOA's personal meeting club room, complete with stocked bar. So the company vehicles, this referred to any vehicle that had a company's name on it. Basically a no advertising rule. One of the HOA heads had their own company car, which was excluded from being fined. But our neighbor, the sheriff, was told he couldn't have his car in the neighborhood. His response was to park it in the street, as the official wording was, no company vehicles parked in the driveways of any house. The HOA's response was to ban any and all vehicles from being parked in the street. The sheriff told them to pound sand. There were many battles between the sheriff and the neighborhood, including them threatening to tow his police car and him saying, quote, "Go ahead and do it. I'd like to see the tow truck driver who would pull this thing." His car was never towed. After witnessing how hard the HOA changed rules and harassed one officer, I vowed I'd never live in one. Story 36. Holy crap, shame I'm so late. I'm literally in the process of moving because I had to get a lawyer about a week ago to fight my HOA. My neighbor complained that my dog was barking, but I was issued a citation for leaving my dog outside unattended. Not only did we not do this, but there was no mention of a neighbor making a complaint, so we assumed the HOA walked by, came to the conclusion my dogs were outside without me, and issued me a warning. Probably won't happen again. Well, month 2, I get another citation for the same thing. Weird, but coincidences happen. I'm gonna let it slide again. Month 3, I get another citation. Now I'm upset. Not only are we not doing this, but my yard is surrounded by a 6-foot-tall privacy fence. How would they know if I'm in my own backyard? Also, I do not have a corner lot, and the houses sit on the property line, so my fence bumps up against my neighbor's house. The only part of my fence you can see is my gate, so what the F? So I emailed the HOA and ask how they've decided I'm not in my backyard. They respond that because I have a dog door, the dogs could come and go as they please. Not that the dogs actually are, just that they could. Maybe. Also, there are literally no rules against having a dog door. So I go to the meeting to fight the charges. At the meeting, they decide to tell me it's because a neighbor made a complaint about my dog barking. I argue that while that's unfortunate, it's irrelevant because that's not what I was issued a citation for. I'll be more than happy to resolve my dog barking, but currently you're about to fine me for something I didn't do based on the idea that I have a dog door I'm legally allowed to have. I try to explain to them that they literally cannot do this. They find me guilty and fine me $10 a day, every day. It was a problem. It comes to just under $1,000. I lose my crap. About a week later, a member of the HOA says all I have to do is send an email asking the fine be forgiven, and it'll probably be dropped. So I do. The HOA has their meeting. They reject my email. I'm told I basically have to write a false confession saying I was leaving my dogs outside, and then apologize for doing so and explain how I fixed it. No way. I know what this is. The HOA has totally realized that what they did was illegal, and they realized I'm not going to just pay the fine. Now they're crapping bricks, and so they want me to write a false confession to clear their name. Nope. I tell that lady, Miss Linda Riddle, to F off in every way I possibly could. So I went to a lawyer. Cost $150, and he agreed with me. The problem is, if you really want to fight this, it could get expensive. Lawyers charge per hour, and so if they have to draft up some official paper, that usually takes about an hour. At $150 or $200 an hour, it'd only be 4 or 5 hours of fighting before it would be even cheaper to just pay the unfair fine. But none of that mattered. Turns out they were supposed to give me 14 days notice of my hearing, but they only gave me 4, meaning the hearing was invalid, and with it, the ruling of the hearing, including the fines. All fines had to be dropped, and they were. But the day my lawyer sent them the letter explaining the hearing was invalid, I called a realtor. My house will be on the market probably Monday, and I told the realtor the only thing I won't give in on is an HOA. Yard size, covered porch, etc. are all negotiable, but if the house has an HOA, don't even bother showing it to me. Story 37. Our COA, condo, community consists of 4 identical buildings. Our unit is directly below the head of the COAs, and when the place was purchased, by my now fiancé about 2 months before we met, it was advertised as pet-friendly, but the condo docs prohibit pets. However, there are a dozen residents in the other 3 units that have dogs. I met my fiancé and am a package deal with my dog. So we jump through hoops. He gets an ESA letter for the dog. Before someone wants to start, he has ADHD and without a doubt benefits with a dog to wake up and walk, care for, etc., so keep judgments out. The head of the COA above us, let's call her Kathy, is the biggest raging see you next Tuesday anybody has ever met. As it turns out, she demands that our building not have any dogs in it because she doesn't want to hear the barking. She even had the gall to say in writing that the ADA and fair housing laws, federal laws, do not supersede the condo docs. That's exactly what they do. After threatening a lawsuit to her, she let up. There's been issues with her over the one guest parking spot for the building, directly in front of our door, with a no overnight parking sign that she kept her car parked there for so long, spider webs formed on the tires, just to spite me because my disabled dad uses that spot when he visits. The neighbors on each side of us have young children, and both dads worked together one day to build a swing from one of the trees in the grass area outside our patios. Kathy demanded it to be removed. Additionally, our security gate is never functional. The association sent out a yearly budget ahead of a scheduled meeting. The budget for that gate this year is $4K. They projected it to cost $50K for 2021. A couple days after seeing that budget, we get a notice that the meeting is canceled, probably because everybody was asking about that BS $50K budget for something that never works. P.S. We just got a new gate system earlier this year, so it's not like it's so old it stopped functioning. It's just a whole bunch of bureaucratic BS. We will never again live somewhere where we have to pay someone to tell us what we can and can't do with property that we own. Story 38. My boyfriend came to visit me in my HOA neighborhood. We left in my car to see a show and returned about 4 hours later to find that his truck was gone. We immediately guessed it had something to do with the F-ass HOA overlord that was always terrorizing people. I called him and he explained the truck was towed because it was parked in a visitor spot and the truck was there so frequently, about once every few days, that there was no way he was a visitor. I adamantly explained that he was in fact a visitor and begged for the HOA to get the truck back. He told me that I was lying to get out of paying for it. Over the course of this conversation, he demanded to know inappropriate and personal things in exchange for the possibility of getting the truck back. He asked how long my boyfriend and I had been together, how often we'd been seeing each other, why he needed to stay the night, what he did for a living, and even had the audacity to propose that I get his permission every time my boyfriend visited so that truck not get towed in the future. I asked, if he's a visitor and he gets towed for parking in the visitor section, where the hell is he supposed to park? Explain to me what we could have done to not fall victim to you in this situation. After over an hour on the phone, I guess he'd gathered enough evidence to believe me, and the truck was brought back. My friend is the one who owned the house, and one day she started getting emails from the HOA declaring they would start charging her $100 a day if she did not inhabit the house. She had a job that required like 80% travel, and they said that basically meant she wasn't living there, which somehow violated their rules. The HOA overlord told her, proudly, that he'd forced 3 other residents that year to sell their houses and that she was next. And he was right. After a couple of months of threatening emails and made-up fines, my friend gave in and sold her house. I hated her going through that, but honestly think it's the best thing she could have done. No one should buy a house only to answer to an unreasonable, power-hungry tyrant like that. FHOAs. Story 39. I moved in with my then boyfriend, which means I came into the HOA without being approved ahead of time. I was the only non-white person, which I suspect was the issue. Basically, I could do nothing right, even though I followed the rules. The biggest thing I remember was my car. We had one parking spot in front of the house and one garage space in a shared garage. Boyfriend and I each had a car. His was nicer. I pretty much exclusively used mine for work, so we kept his in the garage and mine in the parking lot, and used his if we went anywhere during the day. I worked midnight to 6 a.m., so I figured it was understandable if most of my neighbors never saw my car not in the parking lot. I got notice from the HOA that I couldn't have an abandoned car in the parking lot and that I would have to remove it. I explained that it wasn't abandoned. I used it for work every night. They said it was still an eyesore as it looked like it was abandoned. So I started keeping it in the garage and boyfriend's in the parking lot. I got a notice from the HOA that I couldn't keep an abandoned car in the garage. So I started driving it every day at a time the neighbors would see. We had cluster mailboxes, so I would get the car out of the garage, drive it slowly to the mailbox, check the mail, and drive slowly back. It was ridiculous, but I was naive enough to think that it was really just a misunderstanding. One day, while I was putting it back, there was a neighbor in the garage, and we had some quick, polite small talk. After that, I got notice from the HOA that someone complained my car, quote, smelled like gas, and I couldn't keep it in the garage anymore. Story 40. I'm late, and this will get overlooked, but I'll share anyway. Former resident of an HOA, and never again. It was a new neighborhood, Kentucky if that helps. I built a nice wood dog kennel/house, complete with shingles. They wrote a new rule and voted that dog houses were an eyesore and had me remove it. It was a husky, and he liked being outside as much as possible in the cool months. I built a privacy fence, first in the neighborhood to do it. They wrote a new rule stating no privacy fences, voted it into the rules. I refused to remove mine and fought them. Someone began throwing dead rabbits and chickens over my fence. I put up cameras and it stopped. Next summer, the HOA president builds a fence and they decided privacy fences were to be mandatory. Shake my head. Security cameras became banned next because they presented an eyesore to the external appearances of the home. I got some for inside that watched out the windows so they couldn't be seen. I buy a big smoker grill on wheels with a trailer hitch. It gets added to the things not allowed in the driveway or seen from the street. So I have a concrete pad poured inside my fence and park it there so it can't be seen. They up and outlaw concrete pads in backyards. They're just sending me fines and warnings left and right. I can't and don't remove the pad. I build a koi fish pond in the backyard. This shouldn't be seen by anyone. HOA president climbs over my privacy fence after noticing my cameras were gone, I guess. She walked around the koi pond with this look of shock on her face. She climbs out of my yard. A letter arrives with amended HOA rules the next day. There it is. Koi ponds are now off limits. I checked my camera out of suspicion and caught her plain as day, in my yard while I'm at work. I show this to all neighborhood residents plus HOA members. She gets booted off the HOA. Her brother becomes president. See where that was going? I sure did. I sold and moved out, but not before having to punch him in the face when he approached me over my company truck logo being visible from the street. It wasn't in the rules. He just wanted me to know it was tacky in this neighborhood. I asked him to leave my yard. He postured up and escalated things by poking me in the chest while raising his voice. Edit to add. I get it that it looks like I forged my own path without consulting with the HOA. You'd be correct. I've never felt like I should have had to consult with anyone about what I do with my property. When I said I was new to the neighborhood, I mean I was the third or fourth family to move into it. There was no such thing as an HOA in this neighborhood prior to. Story 41. For me, it was nothing specific to the board. I even took a turn on it a couple of times as it was a small association. During that time, the city offered incentives if we let them do water efficiency walkthroughs, installing new shower heads and such for free. I agreed to supervise him in all the units. One of the units had a woman who was on and off her meds and liked to attempt DIY. She also could not keep track of her payments and liked to argue that we lost them. She had installed a new bath/shower with no tiles above the bathtub. There were holes in the ceiling where she had rewired electrical that didn't end up working. The dishwasher had broken and she'd used it as a drying rack, but never drained it, so it was full of stagnant water. It smelled so bad. At that point, I became pretty sure that at some point she was going to flood or burn down her unit, and the adjoining ones. While the HOA would be able to sue her for the necessary funds as she had rich parents, I just started imagining the headache, as everyone in the HOA would have to pitch in money to repair any of the damaged communal property while she fought to claim that it wasn't her responsibility to pay it, or maybe lawsuits with insurance. In any case, realizing that an HOA puts someone with bad homeowner skills partially in charge of your largest equity investment? Yeah, no thanks. Story 42. Got foreclosed on by my HOA a year after the 2008 housing crash. It all started in 2006. I was 28 and was sick of apartment life. One of the biggest motivating factors for me personally was not having my own washer and dryer. I know, it's dumb. That's not even the dumbest part. While researching whether or not I was ready to buy, I stumbled across a blog/forum that had been around for a few years prior, and it was all about how the housing market was doomed. I devoured it and then thought I could outsmart the crash that I now believed was going to happen. I found a townhome that I liked in a good neighborhood near work and pulled the trigger. I even cashed out my IRA for the down payment. I had marginal credit and the price was a bit over my salary at the time, so I ended up with a subprime ARM. By the time 2008 rolls around, I was already behind on my mortgage and HOA dues. Then I lost my job, but I got decent severance and was picking up contract work, which kept me from sinking completely, but I was unable to catch up on my mortgage or HOA dues. I was in constant contact with the bank and working out a plan to refinance to save the house. Then suddenly the HOA serves me with foreclosure papers. No phone call, no friendly reminder, no stop by and make sure I'm okay, just straight up sheriff banging on the door. Once that happened, I was like, F it, I'm done. Here's what's crazy. The HOA is in a secondary position on the mortgage, so they would be assuming my crazy ARM mortgage by foreclosing. The ridiculous part is, to this day, that townhome still isn't valued at what I paid for it in 2006. By my estimates, even if they refinanced at a much lower interest rate, they would still be upside down today. The state where I lived had a very long foreclosure process that allowed me to live mortgage and rent-free for over a year before I absolutely had to move out. I told the bank the situation and they understood. They were refreshingly honest by saying basically, don't pay us until you resolve what's going on with the HOA because if you don't, they'll still take your townhome. I ended up living in a nice apartment for much cheaper with a washer and dryer in my unit. I eventually moved back home to help with my parents who were having some serious health issues. I didn't know it at the time, but they would both pass away due to these issues. So I'm really glad I got to move back and connect with them and help them out as best I could when they needed me most. I also met my now wife, and we now have 2 kids together. My credit has fully recovered, and my career is on solid ground, even during COVID, but that townhome is still a loss for that stupid HOA. Better them than I, right? Story 43. Finally, my time to shine. The story begins with saying our family has usually always been hated by neighbors. My mom is a foster parent that adopted 7 children and had 4 foster kids under the age of 4, so we were loud and definitely annoying for neighbors. Well, everyone got older. I'm the youngest, and my mom finally decided to buy herself a new home. She was excited, picked everything out. We moved in. Our neighbor happened to be a man named Nazi Bob, a name given by my sweet mom. He was relentless. One hot summer day, my friend and I, 14 years old, decided to wash my mom's car. We put a CD in a small boombox and had the sound down low. Don't want to wake the 4 babies my mom just put down for a nap. 5 minutes in, and Nazi Bob storms over, face bright red. He starts yelling at us, saying we can't have music playing outside. It's 1 p.m., guys. Us being 14, we simply told the man to piss off. He gets more angry and literally enters the garage and starts banging on the garage door. My mom is visibly upset, thinking something happened to us. He starts yelling about our music and saying young girls shouldn't wear bikinis. We were wearing bathing suits because it was hot and we were outside washing the car. He fines my mom for loud music. This was just the beginning. He tried fining my mom because our houses shared a wall with the neighbor's backyard. They had courtyard-type yards, and he said we had to put in blackout curtains in my room because he could see me getting out of the shower from his second-story office. We had a police officer move in across the street, and my mom confided in him one day. She was shocked to discover Nazi Bob had been sending him fines as well. One was for parking his police work vehicle in the driveway. Oh, there's so many stories to tell of Nazi Bob, but the happy ending is my mom moved out of that house and got a new house without HOA. She immediately painted her house purple. This was 13 years ago now. I've had my own horrible experiences owning a house of my own with HOA. Never again. Story 44. This is going to be a little different from most HOA stories, but F it. Let's go. A few years back, my household and I, 7 roommates and myself, found a great deal on a rental in a really nice development. However, the reason the rental was such a great deal was that this really nice development had been built in the middle of downtown Heroinville, USA. The area I live in is pretty nice, generally, but there's one highway that's notorious as a sort of corridor of inequity, and the city we're in was the low-income den of vice along this highway of sin. Suffice to say, while the house was nice, the area was rough. In the year we were there, I had to call 911 5 times for ODs I encountered on my walk to work. A few years back, there was a photo that hit the front page of subreddit pics. It was of a cleanup effort that resulted in a 6-foot-high pile of discarded needles. I remember seeing the post and looking up to see the cleanup effort happening across the street for where I was. I used to crunch across old syringes the entire route to and from the bus like it was new snow. None of this is an exaggeration. It was not ideal. However, as stated, the development we lived in was pretty nice and occupied by largely nice, middle-class aspiring folks, and, as such, they had quickly formed an HOA when the development was developed. They were pretty banal as far as HOAs go, as the houses didn't really have much in the way of yards and everything was pretty uniform as a matter of how the area was built, so there wasn't a lot for them to go super power crazy about. Mostly, they occupied their time in the cisfusion task of repainting over the graffiti on the outer fences. Cheers, you do you. Now, for all the crime that happened outside our gates, it didn't enter the development much. A couple of high or homeless folks might stumble through the main thoroughfare once in a while. There were definitely a handful of drug deals in our parking lot, and a couple of extremely inept attempts at burglary, one of which occurred at our house and consisted of a very high gentleman knocking on my window and being incredibly startled when I snapped my fingers at him and told him to get like he was a raccoon in the garbage or something. This is all bad, obviously, but so far fairly harmless to the residents. Then, whatever lady was running the HOA, let's call her Debbie, got it in her head that what this place needed was some real discipline. She banded together with the only other 2 white ladies and one portly gentleman in a rotating cast of football jerseys to form a sort of neighborhood watch/vigilante militia to patrol the development in the evenings. This was easily the highlight of my time living there. Not only did they perform these patrols, but they also saw fit to write intense missives about their activities that they sent out in neighborhood email blasts every couple of days. These emails teeter-tottered wildly between intense pearl-clutching hysteria and genuinely worrisome ignorance of danger. They got themselves into all manner of pickles by A, knocking on drug dealers' car windows and refusing to move out from in front of their cars, B, not recognizing weapons as weapons, C, misrecognizing non-weapons as weapons, D, calling the cops on the cops they called because they didn't realize they were cops, E, getting stuck with needles while trying to clean up needles with no gloves, F, assuming that a force field kept out all outsiders and all internal crime was the result of guests of residents and or criminals they were harassing could not physically follow them past the gates, etc. I'm not a huge fan of crime, violence, or life-destroying drugs, and I'll grant you, the area needed some cleaning up. However, the sheer ballsy ineptitude of this quartet wound up driving crime rates in the development way higher than previously seen, and, to my understanding, result in multiple talking tos from local cops for either placing themselves wildly in danger and or interfering with random innocents. The emails were always the highlight of my morning, and I was desperately sad when they finally remembered to take me off their mailing list a year or so after we all moved out. Story 45. Let's take a different stance than most people here. I currently live in an HOA and my wife is on the board. As far as HOAs go, this one is pretty laid back. If your grass gets above knee height, you'll get a letter in the mail stating you have 2 weeks to cut your yard. But inspections are only done once a month, so technically you have about 4 weeks. On top of this, if you call/email the property manager with any reasons you can't fix the deficiencies, they're extremely lenient. We've had residents do this and state that their mower is broken and they cannot afford to fix it, so the HOA members themselves offer to cut their yard for free until they can fix their mower. Now, That all being said, some individual people are just as bad as some HOAs. My neighbor across the street came to my door one day a few years back. It was early afternoon and he was piss drunk. Stumbling, slurred speech, the works. I asked him if I could help him, because aside from the occasional wave, I don't really know him. He demanded to speak to my wife because of a $25 fine he got. I told him that there was no way that was going to happen with him in the state he was in. My wife had actually taken our kids for a walk around the block, but he didn't need to know that. He then proceeded to threaten to kill me, shoot out the radios in my house, pour bleach in my yard. He even threatened me his Aryan Brotherhood tattoo and informed me that he isn't afraid to go back into jail for assault. I laughed in his face. As a disabled Army vet, this kind of a confrontation didn't bother me. It wasn't until my wife came back from her walk and he started threatening both of us in front of our kids that he struck a nerve. I called the cops, but by the time they arrived, he was already back inside his house. The cops said that since he didn't actually touch anyone, left our property, and wasn't actively causing problems, they couldn't do anything. Since then, every time my kids are in my front yard, I keep a close eye on his house. All because he was butthurt over a $25 fine he had 2 weeks to fix, or simply communicate about. Story 46. This is a relatively long one and will get buried, but my parents built a house in 2000 that was not a part of an HOA on a private road/dead end with only one other house. In summer of 2001, my parents were contacted by the HOA that was made up of permanent and semi-permanent properties behind our house. They told us that we needed to pay for access to the boathouse, boat launch, and summer water hookups. My parents said no thanks since they had town water and didn't need the seasonal water, and at the time didn't have a boat. Fast forward a couple years and the wife of the president of the HOA is walking her tiny dog in my parents' front yard and leaving its crap all over the place. Our dog is very territorial, so my parents give her a heads up and ask her to not walk her dog in our yard. Argument ensues, and my parents end up posting the land and putting up no trespassing signs to get the point across. Another couple years go by, and some woman from out of state comes in and says she has deeds to all the roads and right-of-ways in our area, including our own, and is charging back maintenance and snow removal fees, which my parents and only our neighbor had done for the 10 years prior, and the neighbor had done for 30 years prior to that. My parents tell her to go F herself. Now the HOA president, who lives on an adjacent property to us, wants her to open up her road because it's well maintained and doesn't have massive potholes and gives the access to the water main. We say no. She sends trucks to do it. We take her to court. A few years of long, drawn-out legal battles ensues, and after that, my parents get frustrated enough to just buy our road and right-of-way so it can't be opened up. Fast forward another few years, and the HOA president sells his property and exchanges the HOA with some other people. New owner comes in, says he's opening our road and hooking up to the water main. We tell him no, and he sends trucks to do it anyway. The guy from the water company realizes whose property it is and says he's not effing with that. Tries to bring it up at the town meeting, and more headache ensues. Town says you can't own a right-of-way. Insert fuming parents. New neighbors to the back do not want the road opened, and turns out to be some incredibly wealthy people spending summers in a multi-million-dollar home, and tell my parents that they will pay a lawyer to take care of it. In the end, the guy ended up paying my parents for access and digging in the right-of-way, and nothing has happened since. Story 47. I effing hate my HOA, so I decided to run for a seat on the board to try and make changes from the inside. I was elected with 2 other new folks. As the freshmen on the board, we tended to band together on matters. At the second meeting, the president abruptly resigned, and through a series of successive resignations, I was suddenly the president of the board. During my time, I answered emails from people bickering about their neighbors parking in their driveway, and not the garage, people walking on someone else's grass, neighbors complaining about satellite antennas being installed on the front of the house, etc. My emails generally said, that isn't a violation of the HOA bylaws. You should go talk to that person and politely address it as neighbors. After a year, another board member, who I'd added to Facebook while we were running for the board, decided she didn't like my emails. So she dug way back into my Facebook history and found 4 posts that, put out of context, weren't fantastic. I'm a veteran and I have some rambunctious friends. I make no apologies. She sent screenshots of these comments without context to several very vocal members of the neighborhood, who then demanded that I be removed. The board called a meeting to ask me to resign. She didn't show up. What's funny is I still live in that neighborhood and none of them do. I used to really enjoy taking walks through the neighborhood past their house. I'd give a huge fake smile and wave. F those Fs and F the HOA. Story 48. My last HOA was horrific. The members were made of retirees who had nothing better to do than to try and control the community. Here's a list of infractions I accrued. 1. Excessive noise during quiet hours. My neighbor liked to leave her window open for fresh air. Where we live, it gets to be over 100 in the summer, so I'm blasting AC even at night when it's 80. She didn't like my AC being on because she could hear it from her open window. 2. Trash cans left out too long after trash being picked up. The trash people came at 6 a.m. I don't even wake up until 8 a.m. The timestamp on the infraction was at 6:30 a.m. 3. Cars blocking the sidewalk. The driveways were very long and can fit up to 2 cars snugly. One day, our friends came over and one car was maybe 1 centimeter over my driveway and into the 4-foot wide sidewalk. 4. Unauthorized vehicles in front of the home for delivery truck for our new appliances came. 5. Excessive packages in front of our door. When we first moved in, we naturally ordered a lot of stuff from Amazon. The HOA expected us to receive the packages immediately. There's more, but in the end, we didn't pay a cent because my best friend is an attorney, and after going through all the HOA rules, we violated nothing and threatened to sue said HOA. We moved after 2 years. Our neighbor who stayed told us that after we moved, our story became infamous and led to the entire neighborhood fighting back against the HOA and revamping the entire system. Story 49. My old house had an HOA that had a management company, but the board members were still busybody Karens. One was an old woman who regularly walked the neighborhood early in the morning with a wooden ruler to measure people's grass and weeds. She had me cited more than once because of a single weed. Not exaggerating. I'd have a mowed lawn with one weed stem poking up in a corner. That would grow bigger than the grass very quickly, even though the lawn was mowed weekly. Another time, I got very, very sick with labyrinthitis, basically severe disabling dizziness. I could not walk without falling over, couldn't read or look at a screen without puking, couldn't keep any food down, and literally survived those 3 months by drinking Ensures on my couch. Had to take a leave of absence from college and quit my job. The old woman found out from a neighbor and started targeting me for citations. I got several notices about my lawn being overgrown, even though a couple of friends were kindly coming by and mowing it for me every couple of weeks. I got cited for the trash cans being out too long since I had to crawl on my hands and knees to drag it back and didn't want to do that in the middle of the day in Florida. The HOA rule was moving them back by noon, since the garbage guys came in early in the morning. She also called city code enforcement on me for my car license tag expiring, and had the HOA cite me for having my car sitting unused for an extended period of time. Again, clearly couldn't drive, and she knew how sick I was. I know it was all her, because she bragged about it to a sympathetic neighbor who told me. Once I was finally starting to get better and could read, I read all the HOA bylaws and information and started towing the exact line and used their own bylaws against them whenever I could. For example, one of the rules with the garbage cans was that they had to be pulled out of sight of the road, but all the houses were on a steep hill and flooded, so it was a pain in the ass to drag them all the way to the backyard. And bylaw said that you could build a small structure without prior approval to shield the can from road view. My dad helped me build a stupid-looking little 3-sided cubby hole right by the road for the garbage can, and I painted it garbage can green. Of course, the HOA objected until I pointed out their own bylaw. My intention was to poke them in the eye and maybe force a change for that rule. Instead, several neighbors also put up cubby holes for their trash, because again, dragging cans all the way to the backyard was annoying and difficult, and it became a thing. I drove through the old neighborhood last time I was in town, and just about every house had a version of the ugly trash can cubby hole out front. It looks so much worse now than if the HOA had simply agreed to let folks drag cans to the side of the house. No more HOAs for me. Yes, my neighbor across the street has a large metal shed that they work on cars in for a living, welding and banging around loudly until 10 or 11 p.m. most nights. They have a race car up on blocks in the front yard for a while they tinker with it. Another neighbor frequently has 4 or 5 RVs staying on his land, and has loud dance parties on some weeknights. I don't give a F. That's their property. I have horses, a couple mini dairy cows, goats, sheep, chickens, ducks, and some darn delicious pigs. Freedom is 1,000 times nicer than everyone in the neighborhood having picture-perfect St. Augustine lawns and matching shutters. Story 50. Oh god, it was a nightmare. We lived in a row of 14 townhomes. There was no requirement that they be owner-occupied, so a non-resident, Bob, owned 6, and another, Steve, owned 2. Both of them rented out their units. The HOA was self-managed. The HOA hadn't raised dues in over a decade, and expenses were now more than the dues. Rather than raise dues, a couple residents suggested canceling trash service, and we all take turns hauling trash to the dump. Our roof was 30 plus years old. We finally had to replace it because our insurance company refused to cover any further damage. Bob was an attorney and a complete ass. Because of the old roof, he had some occasional water damage to his units. If we, again, self-managed, so everything fell to the 6 owners who actually lived there, if we did not respond quickly enough, he threatened to sue. I finally called his bluff and told him I'm not interested in his threats, so unless he's serving us with papers, to please knock it off. Steve has not paid his dues in at least a decade. He would constantly promise to send, and nothing. No one wanted to pay money for an attorney. All we had for him was a P.O. box in another state, so we weren't even sure where he lived. We had to do a special assessment for the roof replacement. Steve, of course, did not pay, so the rest of us had to cover his share. We finally persuaded the others to raise dues, and also to sue Steve. He finally sold one of his units and paid his past due amount. After we bought our townhouse, we figured out that the HOA president likely fudged the numbers on the financial disclosure. If we had known what a mess it was, we never would have bought it. We lived there for about 2 years and then moved out of state. There were other factors, but this was a huge part of it. Story 51. My parents downsized to a condo a few years ago, so it's part of an HOA. When they moved in, they got fined because the driveway was too short for the moving truck, so the moving truck stuck out into the road. Not a busy road, and there was enough room to go around, but there was also the time I was living there and we got a fine because the delivery driver pulled up just slightly onto the grass. He was there for 3 minutes or less. They live in a quadruplex, and they're lucky enough to have a large grassy area next to them as opposed to another quadruplex. However, they often get notices to pick up after their dog, or they'll be fined. But they don't have a dog. It's other people not picking up after their dog on this common grass area. But since it's closest to my parents' door, they get the notices and fine warnings. My mother has to call the HOA at least 6 times a year. I just bought my own house. I live in an H-call area, and I can't tell you how many people told me to buy a condo. I didn't want to follow other people's rules, though. I didn't get everything I wanted by buying a single-family home instead of a condo, but I get to live my life the way I want, and that's worth living on a busy road. Story 52. We didn't even get our stuff moved in before we got a notice to put a light on our yard, something the previous owner took out. When we tried to fight this, the construction HOA board member tried to talk us into a brick light base. Hell no. And tried to say we should be redoing the cedar fence the previous owner had put in because it's not the right color cedar. We were also cited for the dead grass the week we moved in. They said we had to lay down sod or plant grass in the fall. We ripped it all out and planted seed. They didn't like how slow the grass was growing. Our neighbors call the HOA on us for everything. We got a notice to take out a portable AC unit in the summer, even though the sun beats down on that room. They were aware of the issue as previous tenants had one because their kid was in the room. They told us to buy a new AC unit or get central AC. The rest of the house is cold and I'm not spending money when I already have a perfectly good AC unit. Had to change our paint color of exterior house because they didn't like it once applied. They drive around looking for violations. Got a notice to get rid of weeds when our grass was growing in. I want to do what I want. I will never live in an HOA. Our HOA doesn't even provide anything. No pool, park, etc. My friend's HOA lets them do whatever they want to their house. They also have a lake stocked with fish, parks, natural trails. I could live with that one. If I have no choice but to live in an HOA, I'm joining the board and taking it down from the inside. So we know that HOAs, for the most part, suck, as we've kind of discovered through reading through these stories, but one thing that stuck out here is the fact that the neighbors are also calling the HOA on you. Like, shouldn't the neighbors, the residents, band together in solidarity to take down the evil tyrant that's the HOA? I don't know, maybe I just played too many video games. Story 53. True story. When I was working litigation as a paralegal, we did a case against a HOA that was tyrannical. One resident had over 125 violation tickets over the course of a year. We sued the hell out of the HOA and basically we bankrupted it. We forced the HOA to buy the home and pay all the fees plus 15% increase in home value over current market, plus an extra $100K in damages and full lawyer's fees. The HOA was dissolved shortly thereafter, and there was like 50 lawsuits that flew around afterward. Everyone involved just kept blaming and suing other people. Some of the highlights. Plaintiff was written up over a dozen times for flying a flag past dusk. Federal law controls flags, not a HOA. The plaintiff recorded himself taking down the flag every night before dark, all time-stamped including the days in question. Over 30 infractions for parking in a crooked manner. Again, the plaintiff took a pic of every time they parked. The best that made the judge furious. 44 citations for, and I quote, garbage of a nature as to cause odors that were distasteful to the neighborhood. I'll always remember that one. The whole development area sued the contractors, and they cued the management company. It was hilarious, but the firm got like 10 clients and made well over $1 million in fees and award out of that development. From what I understand, there's still no construction on the planned addition of 50 more homes in the development because so many homes are still for sale. A handful were foreclosed because of lawsuits, and a few abandoned when people just said F it and surrendered their home back to the HOA, which acted as a bank for the mortgages. So if you're ever faced with an unruly HOA, document everything. Seriously, get a cheapo PC and hook up a 24/7 camera discreetly, of course. Keep records of everything. If you go out, have a camera pointed on where you park, etc. Any harassment at all, recorded. It's likely to swing a judge in your favor. Now, always remember that this case was in Massachusetts, whether HOAs do not have a legal foothold, as strong as they say a condo association does. In some states, once you agree to abide by the HOA's rules, you're screwed until you can sell. Unless you can show unfair treatment or harassment. Document and video everything. Seriously, if you live in a state that allows it, record your phone calls from the HOA as well. Story 54. My wife and I had an HOA at our first house. It was a townhome complex with about 12 to 15 blocks of homes. Each block was 4 houses. They were only about 18 months old when we moved in, and we loved it. We moved in late spring/early summer. I was thinking it was great. Winter hit, and our $100 a month HOA was used to pay for snow removal, snow plowing, shoveling the pathways, and salting the area. This never got done. When they plowed, it was straight down the middle of the road, and that pushed the snow up against the garage door and would freeze them down and stop them from working. The shoveling and salting was a joke. They ended up just putting a shovel in a bucket of ice melt for each block and said, clear it out if you want it gone. That wasn't fun, but then the next spring they took out the park for the kids and let the grass all die. The sprinklers stopped working and it was all brown and dead, so I said, I'm done. I told our HOA I'm not paying them a penny more until they do what they were contracted to do. Fast forward a year, and my wife and I decided to sell and move because we hated it. Little did I know at the time, they had the power to put a lien on my house until current on HOA dues. A-holes. I had to pay up the 12 months before I could sell my own house. Never ever again will I have an HOA. I don't care what amenities they include. I'll never support them. Story 55. I was a renter in a HOA. 1. We had to check out a key anytime we wanted to use the pool or basketball court. Every single time we went to use the pool, the 80-year-old head HOA guy would walk over from his house to the office there, I guess to act as a safeguard. My girlfriend was super creeped out by that, and we ended up only using the pool a couple times that year. 2. We couldn't keep our dog on the attached backyard patio for more than 5 minutes. You couldn't leave dog food out there either. You also couldn't grill food out there. Instead, you'd have to use the designated built-in grills, which were about 20 feet away from the back of the house. 3. It was a $15 fine to leave trash cans out after 4 p.m., so you basically can never go on vacation unless you leave your trash can inside your garage that entire time. 4. I had to pay $50 to clean some oil that dripped onto the driveway from my car. My car was 2 years old, so it was just a couple of drops here and there. 5. My own car got several parking tickets because we only had 1 parking pass. Although you could put 2 cars in the garage and 2 in the driveway, we were college kids that often had our GFs and BFs over. I'd volunteer to park my car on the street so that my girlfriend would avoid tickets. Those $20 tickets were charged to the homeowner, who then charged me. So yeah, you could register your car with the HOA and still get a ticket, because the tow truck would excitedly drive by a few times a night handing out tickets, instead of towing through the HOA. Not all HOAs are this bad, and this wasn't as bad as others I've read. but I don't ever want to live in one ever again. Story 56. I had several small problems, but only one that really cost me. My first home was a zero lot line small house within a large HOA community. My neighbor built a fence between our property that I was pretty certain was a violation of the HOA. I won't go into how exactly, long explanation. And I should note that I liked having this fence and I got along with this neighbor very well. Normally, I wouldn't have cared one bit, except it was a zero lot line and the fence was on the lot line, meaning it was considered both of ours per the HOA rules. I talked to the HOA, worried that the fence would cause me problems with them over this possible violation, and they sent out the neighborhood inspector. Both my neighbor and I were happy when he gave the fence a thumbs up. Fast forward about 5 years later, and life circumstances are forcing me to move. I get a very good offer on the house, which I accept. This was mid-2008, just before the real estate bubble fully bursting, which hit our area harder than most. Just days before the close, I get a notice from the neighborhood stating the sale cannot go through until the fence is removed and replaced in a compliant manner. Removing it wasn't enough. According to the neighborhood, it had to be replaced. I fought tooth and nail, citing the neighborhood inspector approval and showing my old paperwork. It didn't matter. The inspector had recently passed away and they had no records of their own. They argued it wouldn't matter because he was clearly wrong in his approval of the fence anyways, so there was no convincing him. The HOA rule the old fence violated, the exact one I originally thought it might, forced enough of a change the local city considered it an entirely new fence and not just a rebuilt one. This difference meant I needed a new permit. The town was notoriously slow and expensive with granting permits, and it took several weeks to get. By the time the job was done, the buyer had long since backed out and the real estate market was considerably worse off. I was forced to rent it for a few years before finally selling it for much less than the 2008 offer. Story 57. We're in due diligence on a new house because of our current HOA. We've lived here for about 5 years with escalating issues with them over time. First, it was our fence wasn't a natural wood color. Y'all, it was natural wood with no stain on it at all. It was literally natural wood. They began fining us until we painted it, which we did an off-white color. Our house is white, so personally I think it looks bad compared to the light tan/gray of the wood, but they asked for it. Next, we had to rebuild our deck due to safety issues. Husband and his squad, police officer, come over to help. Sheriff even came to help. HOA president came over to tell us we had to stop immediately because we didn't ask permission or get a building permit. The latter I get because that's legal stuff, but the former we didn't think we needed since we were rebuilding the exact same thing as before. Husband was livid. The president just strolled right up in our yard and into the gated area without knocking, just like he lived there. Dude came by the following Monday to make sure we weren't working on it without his permission. The final straw is my husband went out for a canine position and got it. He talked to the same guy before about a kennel, which is required by the sheriff's department since she's a bite dog for liability reasons. This guy's son was a canine officer, and his son-in-law instructs the canine school. At first, he was cool with it, just asked to see the plans beforehand. Okay, sure. Husband goes to show him one day about a month ago, and he loses it, refusing to look and telling him to, quote, "Look at your bylaws." He says no kennels at all. In the bylaws it reads, no kennels of chain link, cyclone, or other weak material. This kennel is none of those things. Ours is welded metal. He still refuses and says we can get a lawyer and fight, and until then he'll charge us $25 a day. We could file and do an exception and have a neighborhood vote, but that would cost us like $500 annually to file, and husband was just fed up. Said F them and we're moving now. Story 58. I'm in construction and real estate. Someone I know had a rental property that had an eviction and hired my guys to remodel the place after the slob tenants got the boot. There is a lot of crap, figuratively and literal, as well as construction garbage we had to get rid of, and the HOA wouldn't let us get a dumpster for a day or two. Got a complaint saying all the stuff in the backyard needs to go to the house. I said, F that, it's going to the curb for 2 days until the garbage trucks come. Sure enough, I went to check up on how the site was doing, and a village car rolls up with 2 fat mouth breathers who look exactly like the people you'd assume need to be in everyone else's business for standing outside. First thing I do is close the door. They can all talk to me outside. I asked what's the problem. The village person asked who I was and what I was doing. I told him all the construction happening for this evicted unit, and none of it needed permits from the village. There are no indications showing otherwise, such as copper piping, conduit, large drywall, scraps, etc. He asked the HOA what's wrong, and they just said he can't put the carnage where the garbage collection is picked up. First thing the village guy says is, okay, well, this is a result of an eviction. I'll need you to show me in the bylaws of the HOA the proper process of dealing with an eviction on a property within the HOA. The HOA reps' mouths just dropped to the floor because there was no violation to their beloved handbook. I told the village guy to have a good day and the HOA people to F off and mind their own business. For the next week, those two would show up and try and come inside. I was tempted to get a dumpster just because I know it would have gotten under their skin. Another crap HOA story is my friend got a notice from his saying they didn't like his curtains and he needed to replace them. Those are my two stories from HOAs I don't even live in, and they can all F right off. Story 59. So I'm actually in the middle of moving out from my HOA neighborhood. I bought the house about 5 years ago and had some light brown wooden plantation blinds on the window. Very good quality. Looked great. After 2 years, HOA sends me a letter saying I need to fix my blinds as it violates the rules. I send the rules back with the blinds rules highlighted. All blinds must be architecturally white or other neutral color. I told them that if they could find a definition of neutral that didn't include brown, then I'd replace them. Fast forward 3 more years and I've had 2 more letters with the same comment and the same answer. I get an updated set of rules that were changed without any member input or notifications. Cool. Really crappy of them, but whatever. Except I get down to the blind section. Now all blinds can only be white. I live in the back corner of the neighborhood, so I pass all the houses on my way home. All other houses have white blinds. I'm the only one with wooden, so yeah, they changed the rules just to bully me. I snapped and immediately started searching for a new house. And for real, I wouldn't be as miffed except they cared about petty crap like this and whether they could see your dumpster from the street, or their no grills rules and not real issues like people just parking all over the street and sometimes making our road almost impassable. So yeah, FHOAs. Story 60. Moved into our first home and wanted to get new windows. We owned a townhome unit. We still had to get everything done to the outside approved by the HOA. We submitted the application for new windows in spring. They didn't approve it until winter, in Chicago. So there's November and we have 4 massive holes in our house where the workers have torn out the windows to replace the new ones. Would have been great if that was in the summer like it was intended. Another favorite of mine was when our HOA decided our small 2-street subdivision needed 15 cameras. One day, there are workers putting up security cameras on every corner of the neighborhood. No newsletter, no announcement, just board members agreeing to this and then wanted to charge every unit $1,000 out of nowhere for these cameras. I called up and asked if we would have access to these cameras. I was told no. I asked who does have access to the cams, and she said the board members do so they can monitor the activity in the streets. I told the lady that I wasn't going to pay for something that is essentially a toy for the board members. I also did the math, and if every unit had to pay the $1,000 they were asking for $86K to install 15 cameras. Told her again I wasn't paying, and this smells illegal, and hung up. Never ended up paying their $1,000 and gladly sold the house to the next sucker. Oh, and the guy that lived above our garage was a member of the board and absolutely refused to fix his AC as it would run for days on end and the drip pan would overflow and leak into our ceiling. The units were placed like a jigsaw puzzle rather than the straight slots for townhomes. Every year he would cause water damage, and because it wasn't on the outside of the building, they refused to even say anything to him. I'm not shy and confronted him about it. He told me it was because of some construction we were doing, but we weren't doing construction. Later, that old F fell down the stairs and moved out to assisted living. To add another thing, we would pay $230 a month for their HOA and services, but would always get shafted or the least amount of service possible. For instance, snow removal. We lived in Chicago and would always get a solid foot of snow. The HOA would hire a plow to take care of snow removal, but the a-hole would only come twice per season. Once at the very beginning, like when the street gets dusted, he goes out and spreads salt. Thanks, homie. But would come back until some random day to do a plowing, but that was it. Usually it turned into an every morning struggle to dig out not only of your own driveway, but also down the street and out. Lesson to be learned, kids. HOA is a bunch of scummy extortionists that are literally good for nothing. Story 61. Honestly, the HOA itself is fine. The board is made up of residents who care. The rules are mostly reasonable, and overall it's pretty fair. The absolute worst thing about a HOA is the neighbors. 95% of the neighbors are fine. I don't have to talk with most of them. I have a good relationship with the houses in my immediate vicinity. All good. But the remaining 1 to 5% of people are just the worst. They're constantly breaking the rules and causing a ruckus about it. We have a rule about flags. You're allowed up to 2 flags on your property. Want to fly the US flag? Fine. Want to fly the state flag? Fine. Want to fly the flag of some other country because that's your heritage? Fine. Want to fly the flag of a branch of the military? Fine. Want to fly the flag of your favorite sports team? Fine. Want to fly a flag with Charlie Brown or Mickey Mouse because whatever? Fine. You can do all of those things and no one gives a F, but we have people who are constantly being vocal crapheads because we won't let them fly 38 flags all at once. We have a rule about parking. I lived here when the rule was created. Originally, there were no parking rules. Then the fire department wrote a letter to the HOA saying that they couldn't get their fire trucks down every street, so we needed to adopt parking only on one side of each street. We had a meeting about it, and the decision was made that we would do alternate side parking based on the month. On odd months, January, March, May, etc., you could park on the side of the street with odd-numbered homes. On even months, February, April, June, etc., you could park on the street with even-numbered homes. 95% plus of people said that's reasonable and complied. We have a few vocal crapheads, however, that won't shut up about parking. They make claims like it's too complicated and how will anyone ever remember where to park? My thoughts to those statements are simple. Damn, you're one dumb mother effer if you can't understand what an odd or even number is. How these people even put their underwear on each morning, let alone figure out how to register and post on Nextdoor, Facebook, and attend board meetings, that's what I don't understand. I could go on, but it really boils down to the same theme. Insane people are going to act crazy no matter what. The rules are pretty darn reasonable, but some crazy a-holes always cause problems. Story 63. We don't really qualify since we still live under an HOA, but I do just want to share. The house we live in was put up by my grandparents a long time ago, before we were conquered by a subdivision, and subsequently an HOA. They're mostly harmless since we do enjoy the benefit of security, but there have been a few minor brush-ins. The front of our house is along a public tricycle route, which our late grandfather enjoyed. He was friends with plenty of them, on the account of their shared heritage and my grandfather's congeniality. Some of the filthy rich owners who had their own means of private transportation wanted them gone, and filed a petition to do so since their peace was disturbed by the sound of tricycles' mufflers, which was how they were supposed to sound. None of the tricycle drivers could afford to purchase loud mufflers. Gramps filed a counterpetition, accusing the opposition of being insensitive to the needs of those who make use of the public tricycles, citing his own example. He's a stroke victim and walks with a cane, so it takes him 30 minutes to walk 50 meters. That petition went away and we still enjoy the tricycles. There is also a two-way food park that was erected behind our house, which we're escalating to the local government on account of building code violations. The HOA doesn't want to step in despite complaints from multiple homeowners other than ourselves. The engineer who oversaw the construction of the food park was a former HOA chairman and is likely a part owner. Other than those, we tend to avoid having to deal with the HOA. We join the Viber group in order to keep up with updates for COVID, but rarely participate. They're already fighting amongst themselves over petty issues like garbage bins and one-sided parking, and we just want to be able to live peacefully. One of the things that often came up is the subdivision security detail, which we, as a household, have never had a problem with, and often befriend, but they never last longer than 3 months due to at least one displeased homeowner with every new squad. I think HOAs have their place, but as an organization, it's a breeding ground for conflict due to the variance of residents. Story 64. Not a HOA, but a condominium board, CB, that runs my apartment building. We all pay into a communal fund that's meant to maintain the building, pay electricity in common areas, have the common areas clean, any needed repairs to, say, the elevators, do the gardening, etc. You get the idea. There used to be a different condominium board doing the listed above. At least they were supposed to be doing it, but in the 2008 economic crash, they just stopped doing it. For a few years until around 2014, the maintenance of the building just went undone. except what was required by law, such as the elevators. So loose tiles in the courtyard were never fixed. The once yellow and pink building has faded to white. Not a great loss there, if you ask me. The building looked like a giant Easter egg before. So it was voted at the end of 2014 to oust the old CB and to start the following year to bring in a new CB. Only one issue, because the old CB wasn't maintaining the building, people weren't paying their condominium dues, so there was no money to pay for the necessary repairs. So the new CB didn't really do anything for maintaining the building either, and for the next few years, nothing really changed. Ourselves and a neighbor had a problem where moisture was coming through the roof into the ceiling of our apartment, creating a lot of moisture and humidity. This caused, you guessed it, moldy ceilings. The neighbor's ceiling got so bad that it partially caved in. The CB sent some repair guys to take a look and write up a damage report. The CB refused to release the report and told us that our mold problem was just condensation and that we needed to fix it with some bleach to kill the mold and then a couple coats of antifungal paint. The neighbor complained that their ceiling was caving in and anytime it rained, that they had a waterfall in their living room. The CB refused to acknowledge responsibility and send someone to fix the roof in frustration, and the neighbor filed a suit against the CB. The CB responded by sending some workmen around to fix minor cosmetic things to make it look like their suit was frivolous. Unbeknownst to them, I had already gone around the building taking photos of all the broken stuff. Loose and broken tiles, live exposed wires hanging from walls in the courtyard, construction debris in a big pile on the side of the building, the elevator inspection sticker that said next inspection due 2015 and 2018, and all of it composed into a PDF and emailed it to the neighbors, who then forwarded it to their lawyer. In response, the CB held a meeting and tried to explain that unless the residents pay their condominium dues, then there was no money to paint the building or fix the roof, but the residents were having none of it. A month later, the CB decided they'd had enough of the back and forth and started placing restrictions on what a person can and cannot do with their own apartment. For example, if I wanted to add windows to my front balcony and close it off so I can put a window seat and increase the square footage of my living room, I simply can't. It would violate the CB's bylaws. My neighbors on the side of the building can, but I cannot because my balcony faces the front of the building along the main road. Another example, if you have curtains that are visible through the window, then they have to be from a list of approved neutral tone colors, so you can't decorate as you see fit. Your shutters must be closed by dusk, no later, so people can't see the inside of the building. You can't play music before 9:30 in the morning. Local law says 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m. Local law says 11 p.m., etc. If you're caught violating their ridiculous list of bylaws, then you get fined. Nothing in the bylaws says the money collected by the CB for these fines has to go back into the building, and so far none of it has and nothing has changed. People want a new CB who will maintain the building, but they can't, as when they hired in the new CB, it came out with a 20-year contract that a lot of the residents signed. So until 2035, the residents are stuck with the new CB. My wife and I moved in 2017 and are watching this feud with mild amusement and mild annoyance. Story 65. I will never buy a home in an HOA-run community again. However, my tale comes from the dark side. Longtime HOA board member here. I've lived in a small community of condos for going on 7 years now. When I moved in, unbeknownst to me, the HOA was completely bankrupt. The bills were all delinquent. There is essentially no one keeping track of or enforcing rules. There is a long list of deferred maintenance, including many dangerous trees that had fallen or needed to be brought down. We were uninsured and hadn't filed taxes in years. Long story long, I've spent countless hours and dollars working on the admittedly amateur HOA board to try and get our property back on track. We just want our HOA to handle the simple things. Nothing crazy or overbearing with petty rules or fines, but there is a surprising amount of tasks that go into managing even a small HOA. People expect that maintaining the grounds, keeping the bills paid, and all the administrative background work will just happen, as if by magic. It doesn't. But the real "I'll never live in an HOA again" affirmation comes from the absolutely vile accusations and personal attacks that are so easily hurled by neighbors. Frankly, it can be shockingly juvenile. Anytime a late notice goes out, or a quote for tree removal, lawn care, literally any news or business is shared with the community, I'm met with resistance ranging from apathy to full-on personal attacks and trite threats of litigation. As the reluctant backbone of an HOA board, I have to deal with all the normal responsibilities of being a homeowner, but for the whole community, as well as being an unwilling scapegoat for a vocal minority in the neighborhood. I know, I could just quit, and I will. This is my last year. But in a community of only 7 homeowners, it really has been a case of, if I don't step up, then who will? Anyway, cut your HOA board some slack. It's an absolutely thankless job, and 9 times out of 10, issues are simply caused by a lack of good communication. And that 1 out of 10 times, when it's not just bad communication, take a second to make sure you aren't being the a-hole before making war with your neighbors. Just a thought.